on Trump and Africa, which we are hosting in collaboration with the Study of the United States, University of Pretoria. And the director of that program, Professor Christopher Isike, is also here with us. He will talk about the program later in due course. I want to thank all our partners, those who allow us to stream to their television stations, their radio stations. The majority of people have joined using Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and some are watching on television and radio as we speak. In the interest of full disclosure, we've also created a private viewing, as we did when we interviewed two heads of state, in which government officials and diplomats, officials of ECOWAS and African Union, 3 heads of state are also watching this program. Because of security reasons, we created for them an alternative channel. We are very grateful to these powerful people for joining us. I will talk about other issues in due course. The rules we agreed to is that each of the panelists will talk for 7 minutes. We rotate them, and the 3 panelists will hold a conversation, and we go in turn until we round up. After this round of conversation, we will now invite the members of the audience. I will introduce each of the panelists when it comes to their turn to make their presentation. We agree to this rule in the interest of time and efficiency. This invitation is joined by various media, Elephant in Kenya, Africa in London, we thank you, Tribune, Vanguard, Punch, Guardian of Lagos, we thank the media for joining us. And I will thank other people in due course. It's my pleasure to first invite Professor Carl LeVan to open this conversation. He's very well known in African studies. He edited the highly received Oxford Handbook of Nigerian Politics. I was privileged to be a contributor, and is a professor and chair of politics, governance, and economics, School of International Service, American University in Washington, D.C. And as a professor, he specializes in comparative political institutions, African security, and democratization. He's very well known. He's published over close to 50 essays, and at the moment is writing on post-truth America. And prior to joining the academy, he worked as a legislative director in the US Congress, and then he went to Abuja as an advisor to Nigeria's National Assembly. Welcome, Professor Carl LeVan. Please, 7 minutes, your presentation. Thank you. You're having challenges?
Okay, it wasn't allowing me, the settings for the call were not allowing me to unmute myself. I think we're okay now. Thank you so much for that kind introduction, and it's really an honor to join you for this really important conversation. And I want to begin by saying that at many levels of the United States government and civil society across the United States, there's been a lot of change and a tremendous amount of confusion over the last week, despite President Trump having served previously, and despite a lot of focus on what he might do in foreign policy and foreign assistance and in a range of domestic policy. So I want to highlight a couple of issues that come to my mind, and I want to contextualize them within things that happened in 2017, and really highlight a number of issues that I hope we'll have some time to talk about today, which I think should be very concerning for people who are proponents, advocates, defenders of African democracy, African development, and African independence. So one thing I want to say is that when Donald Trump first came into office, there was a good deal of optimism or hope that Africa policy had always been fairly bipartisan. And so therefore, one would expect not a great deal of change in policy. This is most explicit, for example, in trade policy, the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, which I, as a congressional staffer, was involved in reviewing some of the early drafts of that groundbreaking trade law, which improved over the last 25 years. And also pointing to shared concerns about security and a variety of things. And within a fairly short period of time, I think that that shifted to great disappointment with crude and disparaging comments about Africans living in huts, and indeed other symbolism that really evoked a colonial past and imagery. You know, in that regard, I think we need to really look and see what the new administration does in the coming weeks, and I want to highlight a couple of those areas. Number one, it is encouraging that the president seems to be drawing upon experienced and knowledgeable hands for the region. For example, Peter Pham is likely to become Assistant Secretary of State should he be nominated and approved. Also pointing to well-known security experts lining up for work on security and as the Sahel draws increased attention. But on trade, there's a great deal of concern because in the America First foreign policy, and in the memo that was released on January 20th by the Trump administration, it characterizes trade deficits as, of course, a problem. And so trade during Biden's term, Africa's average trade surplus with the United States averaged about $9.82 billion. Under Trump's first administration, it was about $6 billion on average. And there was a great deal of confusion about this. On Trump's first day in office, he threatened the country of Spain with 100% tariffs and pointed out that it was a member of BRICS, which of course was news to the actual members of BRICS, including South Africa. And this is critical, and I'm mentioning this because AGOA's 10-year renewal expires this September. And so there was an effort a few months ago to try to include it in a congressional continuing resolution. And the gossip in Washington, the information in Washington is that the Trump transition
TV stations send me a note that they want to see that they're seeing your chin. You should raise up a little bit. Apologies. You should. They're complaining. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks. No,
Thanks.
A little bit more. They say their viewers are complaining. Thank you.
I'll take that as a compliment about my chin, I suppose. That the Trump transition team coming into office had removed AGOA from that continuing resolution. It's not clear why. That doesn't necessarily mean that they do not support AGOA, but it's absolutely concerning. What is a more direct signal is that the Trump administration has rescinded President Biden's executive order establishing the Advisory Diaspora Council. And that was rescinded almost immediately. We don't know if it'll be reestablished in another form, but that's certainly something to worry about. On issues like immigration, I hope we have a chance to recall the decline of student visas that happened under the first Trump administration. And of course, the messy attempts to ban Muslim immigration into the United States, which impacted several African countries. And that was litigated through the courts very heavily. And one of the reasons it was litigated is because those executive orders were not drafted by standard Washington procedures with career counsels who would draft such executive orders on behalf of the president, regardless of that president's party. So there were, flaws within within the actual language, and that, immediately caused problems. Another thing I really want to, hope we have time to talk about is climate change. I'm deeply concerned that since between 1991 and 2023, the African continent was warming at a rate of about 0.3 degrees Celsius per decade, which is faster, hotter than the global average. And that's an important statistic because it highlights how global warming disproportionately impacts Africa, even though other countries disproportionately cause global warming. And so in that regard, President Trump's withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accord, executive orders blocking green energy, for example, on wind solar projects, executive orders that will revisit and rewrite the Environmental Protection Agency's research on climate findings. And in general, just efforts to promote fossil fuels are deeply, deeply concerning. And I would underscore that signals a significant reversal of his vice president's position on these issues from only a few years ago. And then lastly, I really hope we get a chance to touch base about the rule of law. With the Proud Boys marching in Washington yesterday, or being physically present in Washington, D.C. yesterday, there's a lot of concern about what the pardons and grants of clemency mean for the January 26 participants, those who participated in the assault on the Capitol and who were convicted. So I also hope we get to talk about that, because it certainly has implications for how the United States thinks about rule of law and the example that it does or does not serve. So hope that's an opening overview.
Thank you very much. I want to bring in all the members of the panelists, but let me ask you the first question. In African politics, there's a critique of the big man. And I also did a book with two of my colleagues on the African big man, the role of the big man in politics. So after we spent all these years criticizing African politics, is Trump not in the mode of the big man that we talk about? You cannot hear me?
I had muted myself and it wasn't allowing me to unmute. I think I'm okay.
Yeah.
So that's a very good question. And I think he is in the tradition of the big man in some ways. He also, I think, will be studied by political scientists like myself for many years for an unusual staying power of populism. I think historically, episodes of populism have arrived furiously and exited rather suddenly. And I think Trump has, appears to have established some staying power. One of my colleagues at American University, Agustina Haraudy from Latin America, pointed out that he's assembled an extremely unusual coalition between labor and capital. And this is something that I think African big men were often, struggled to put together. But I think it's also really important to know that the era of the big men in many countries, including Nigeria, arrived with optimism, and that optimism disappeared, within a very, very short period of time. And so I'm very excited about your book, and I expect to be at the Lagos Studies Association in June to talk a little bit about it, the big man, some of the work on the big man.
Thank you. Ms. Osori?
Hey, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever people are calling from. Thanks for that opening, Carl. I guess for me, I'm curious about AGOA on two levels. One, if it's due to expire in a couple of months, will there be room for Africa as a continent as opposed to individual countries negotiating new terms, more favorable terms? That's one. And two, because there is a sense that South Africa might suffer for its position on Palestine and be ineligible to participate in AGOA, is it possible that if Africa takes a united stand on going forward with it, that they will be able to protect South Africa from any punishment for their position? Thank you.
Please answer a question, Carl, please. Oh, you are muted again?
Yeah. So I think, one of the interesting ideas that my economist colleagues are exploring is the idea that some adverse economic performance in the United States over the next couple of months might inspire President Trump to rethink a whole range of things. And I think I do point to the idea that there has historically been bipartisan support for a trade policy, and imports from different parts of the world, including Africa, are part of a global economy that allows growth without aid. Yesterday, Secretary of State Marco Rubio issued a freeze on virtually all foreign assistance to the United States. And if the United States wants from the United States, and if the United States wants to have partners in development, then it's important to have robust trade relationships and to be able to get the products that consumers from the United States and elsewhere need at competitive prices from the producers who offer some sort of comparative advantage. The America First Trade Policy memo that was issued on January 20th does not even mention AGOA. And so, these are in fact concerning, as the United States thinks about and Africans think about how to establish a trade policy. I'm also alarmed by what this means for a fragmentation of policy. During Trump's first administration, there were some tariffs, and indeed, President Biden kept some of those tariffs in place. But the Office of the United States Trade Representative received more than 50,000 requests for exemptions from those tariffs. So in other words, what that means is that the president, who was promising to, quote unquote, drain the swamp, created a flood of lobbyists and special interests who, for a variety of reasons, had to, issued almost 500,000 requests for exclusions, from those tariffs. So that means, a great shift to elite power, to insider Washington politics, and it's big money that hurts democracy in the United States, and I think hurts a relationship with Africa that's mutually beneficial for all.
Unmute, Prof.
That's it. Thanks. Happy to talk to Ayisah about this a little bit more. Great to see you, Ayisah Osori. And I loved your book on Love Does Not Win Elections.
Thank you,
Prof,
Carl.
you are muted.
I said, please make comments and talk.
Thanks very much, Prof. Let me really thank other panelists and really thank the Training for Learning interview circuit. It provides wonderful opportunity. Carl, my question relates to the speech of the president during the inauguration. He made it quite clear that he wants to stop some of the conflicts raging around the world. At the same time, he spoke about expanding territories for the United States. As we know, territorial disputes are the underlying sources of conflicts in most parts of the world. Is he not blowing cold and hot air around this question? I mean, he's threatening Panama, Canada, Greenland. Who knows who's next? Is he not creating uncertainty that would fuel this security dilemma that you start seeing countries preparing themselves? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, what can I say? The traditional understanding of America First foreign policy was one of isolationism. And I think rhetorically, this often drew upon George Washington's farewell address, where he warned about the complications of America getting involved in what he called foreign entanglements. And instead, what we're seeing with an America First foreign policy is a new brand of bellicosity. And, the one way to just put it is that imperialism is back. Historians in America are scratching their head because Republicans traditionally quote presidents like Eisenhower or Abraham Lincoln, and Donald Trump was quoting William McKinley, who was one of the more expansionist and bellicose presidents of the last 150 years, who carried out, in effect, some of the more expansionist elements of the so-called Monroe Doctrine. So more than just blowing hot and cold air, I think it really undermines America's reputation. And I think, if the president's foreign policies are centered on expansionism towards Canada and Greenland and undermining a democratic government of Panama in order to undo a century of cooperation there, then I'm really worried about the opportunities that creates for more military threats and terrorist threats that continue to be, a concern around much of the world. In fact, when 10,000 United States troops were sent to the border of Mexico in what appears to be or what could be a violation of the Posse Comitatus law going back to the post-Civil War era, it also diverted agents and staff from the Federal Bureau of Investigation who were working on counterterrorism. And, counterterrorism, I think, has had its many, many problems in the United States in the way it unfolded in the years and decades after 9/11. But one thing that we understand from successes is that the successes are the ones that we often don't hear about. And so to suddenly have fewer people working on actual threats to the United States and it is really just something that I think we need to be worried about, and especially as and I think Africans should be thinking about this as they explore ways to stabilize the Sahel and deal with advice and shared strategies for some of its own security problems.
Can I follow up? Should we take the pronouncements of the president as policy pronouncements? I think Prof. Isike would explain later on when he deals with the U.S. how the U.S. formulate policies. I mean, the pronouncement of the president are not necessarily policy positions of the country. How should we take these pronouncements? Should we take them as a done deal that will be factored into the policy formulation that would include other role players in the formulation of the U.S. policy?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think there's a couple layers of answers to that. One layer is that if he says something on Truth Social that a member of his cabinet is fired, that member of the cabinet is fired. If he makes an executive order, for example, withdrawing from the climate accord, or he issued an executive order on so-called restoring freedom of speech and ending federal censorship this week. Those things like that will be often litigated through the courts because the pronouncements, sometimes may be at odds with law, and the president, whatever big man he may be, still does not have the power to unilaterally change law. Some of these executive orders, I think, have been more sweeping than others. In terms of if they're well drafted and narrowly drafted, then they can have more immediate effects. But the executive order on undoing the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution guaranteeing birthright citizenship is unconstitutional. And so immediately when that was issued, there were about 18 states across the United States who filed lawsuits, and that executive order probably will not stand. So again, I think there's different layers of complication. Some pronouncements really do have the effect of a dramatic change, and others will take some time because ultimately he is bound by laws that go back decades.
Professor Isike, your comments and questions for Carl?
Hi, thank you very much, Carl, and to Professor Falola for this platform. Look, I know you started by talking about how better organized Trump is this second time compared to his first term. And we can see the organization also in the way that the executive orders were prepared and presented. But we're already seeing a lot of the inconsistencies, between what he says and what the policy prescriptions are. So that's just on the wayside. But the point I really wanted to harp on is that what makes America great is its internationalism, not isolationism, which Trump's America First implies. So my question really is, does Trump understand what makes America great? Has there been any kind of articulation beyond words that he says in public domains? Is there a known articulation of what America First means?
I think if that's a question for me, I think I would say it's a very narrow understanding of what greatness means. In the 2016 presidential campaign, I think the rhetoric from the Democratic Party highlighted America has always been great. And I think among historians, I think the idea is that, greatness was fought for and established, after a very narrow elitist and, racially limited government was established, in the 1770s and 1780s. And so democracy was not something that was proclaimed. It was something that won over many decades and years of struggles. And I think that greatness includes tolerance. I think it includes a respect for rules and laws that foster political competition. And I think that political competition is also meant to drive economic innovation, making the United States still the most important economy in the world. And I think being a powerful and important economy of the world, means being a part of that world. And I think America First, just fundamentally misunderstands what it means to be a part of that. When I was working on Capitol Hill in the 1990s, and there were all these great debates about the North American Free Trade Agreement, there was this a critique of the left that it was anti-trade. And really what that debate was about the terms of globalization. Who should the beneficiaries of globalization be? Should it be the Elon Musks of the world, or is this a unique historical opportunity for labor rights in trade agreements, for example, to elevate and lift the people who become a part of that global economy by producing things that people around the world want to buy, and by shifting to supply chains and production that has value added, where economies can grow. I think we've really drifted away from that. And I think it's going to be up to American civil society in dialogue with the diaspora and African civil society to really remind the administration and others, what it means. I mean, one of the most striking things to me about the executive order rescinding diversity efforts immediately across the United States federal government is that evidence from psychology and from business schools. I mean, I thought President Trump went to business school, but the business school research suggests that diversity around the corporate boardroom is better. It leads to better results, more robust conversations. Psychologists call it cognitive diversity. And, we're back where we were, I think, 5 years ago, where evidence is just no longer a part of policymaking.
And if I may,
No, Chris, please.
Okay.
Let me make a transition to another person, as we all agreed. And let me announce that 9 African heads of states are watching this program. And I'm very grateful to them. It's for security reasons. They requested a different link where the public will not see them, but we know them. And I'm expressing our deep gratitude to heads of state and their officials who are watching this program. And it means they take not this program, but the Trump administration very seriously. And they are respecting your views in terms of how they will shape their reaction. I want to bring in the experienced diplomat. It's a great guy who's met many American presidents. He's a major public diplomat who served as South Africa's ambassador to Kenya and to Portugal. And he was South Africa's envoy to conflict areas from Comoro Islands to Somalia to Sudan. He served in senior positions in the Department of International Relations and Cooperation. He was the Director General in the Department of Tourism, Chief Executive Officer of Brand South Africa. He's now retired, and he founded his own consulting agency, Risk Recon, that provides strategic advice to government and private sectors. He has a PhD in political science from the University of Pretoria, and he holds a master's degree in diplomatic studies. Kingsley, is your turn, please. Thank you.
Prof, I've really conveyed my most gratitude to you for setting up this platform. I think it's a platform that is worth supporting moving forward. But one critical thing, Prof, I think the Trump administration must understand as they come into power is that the world is different from 5 years ago when they left office. There are different sources of power around the world. There are different powerhouses around the world. And Trump has to know how to manage and navigate his relations with these new powers. But I just want to point out some serious thing that anyone would have looked at them. Any head of state who comes into power in the United States would have been compelled to deal with these issues. The United States is currently having $36 trillion dollar debt. The federal government has, in the last 2 years, spent $6.2 trillion, and they've only been able to raise $4.5 trillion. It is said that fraud within the federal government, it's estimated to be between $233 billion to $521 billion. The defense budget this year alone, it's $895 billion. Where is the United States going to get the money to fund all these projects and new emerging projects? And any president who comes into power would have to deal with these issues. That's why some of us are not surprised by a big focus on domestic issues. This America First, it's intended to address some of those challenges that we see. But the United States has had a plethora of instruments to project its power around the world. I just want to give you a quote that came from Jake Sullivan about 2 years ago, when he said, although the United States remain the world's preeminent power, some of its most vital muscles atrophied. And part of this atrophy that I think we're seeing is within the diplomatic power of the United States. The statecraft that the United States is not better utilizing. I think when Trump comes to power, he has to realize, as part of this policy formulation, that the era of unilateral sanctions, and you are with us or with them, has long passed. And issuing sanctions against China, we've seen China recently really retaliating around what is called the rare earths. Now, the rare earths are the rare mineral resources. And according to the US Geological Survey, the United States has been importing from China between 2014 and 2017, 80% of the rare earths that are processed in China. Between 2018 and 2021, 74%. And China has recently issued out sanctions on the importation of this and serious control, because they are saying they have dual purpose. And the United States needs this rare earths that are really processed by China and sent around the world. And I'm saying this because Trump would have to deal with the question of the US strategy towards sub-Saharan Africa that was unveiled by the Biden administration, which so far remains a policy within the State Department until he revokes it and rescinds this policy. The policy strategic thrust is around how to malign China and malign Russia in Africa. I think that era, it's long gone, is to find a way to deal with China and deal with Russia, because the Chinese and the Russians, they both have some leverages to project their power, because these are new powers that have emerged. But what is going to happen to the continent, and this dependency on a US aid that Trump has put a moratorium now for 90 days on any aid going out. I think the only exception that has been given is Egypt and Israel. What happened to aid that goes to the continent? There are countries within the continent that their budgets are dependent on 30% of foreign aid. And that, it's gone. It's definitely going to go with the new administration. There's a criticism around the transactional nature of the Trump administration. Transactional nature, it's a total different. In diplomacy, we call it reciprocity. You do something in return for me doing something for you. So that's quite usual, and I think leaders within the continent must get used to providing value to their product that are being sent to the United States instead of this duty-free product that are going there, be able to compete with other products that are going to the United States market. The other issue that the Trump administration has to manage is the extraterritoriality behavior of the United States. What do I mean by that? The United States can pass a law that obliges a third-party country to follow that. I think that era is gone. The sooner Trump realizes that, the better he'll be able to make better relations within the continent, and he'll be able to make better relations around the world. even though Trump seems to want to build his legacy around the conflict resolution, particularly violent conflict that are going on around the world, he would have to make serious decision. I think Carl has spoken about the challenges in the Sahel. He would have to deal with the challenges within the greater Americas. He'll have to deal with the challenges in the Horn of Africa. He would have to deal with the challenges that are flaring up around conflict now. I mean, we've seen the flaring up of conflict in the DRC, in eastern part of the DRC. And there's an expectation that the M23 would likely take over Goma by tomorrow. So these are issues that will change. But because he advocates for a peaceful resolution of conflict, you're likely to see changes within the Security Council. The Americans would no longer provide big funding for conflict and peacekeeping around the world. I think it would be wonderful if they were to channel those resources on conflict resolution within, particularly within our continent. There is there is an opportunity and a threat in terms of the Trump administration. Let me first speak about the opportunity. The opportunity presents what we call transactional nature, or what I would call reciprocity. It provides a platform for African leaders to really reconfigure the consumption pattern of relations between Africa and the United States. That's the biggest opportunity. However, I must say that the threat is internal. The absence of strategic leadership within the continent is going to be a big problem to leverage on this, let me call it transactional nature of the Trump administration. So we're going to find a big challenge because of the absence of strategic leadership within the continent. There has been a global collapse of the center-left politics around the world. I mean, the SPD in Germany literally collapsed. They've moved a bit to the right, even to the right of the CDU. You find the same thing with the Socialist Party in Portugal. Their policies are much more to the right. Even the Democrats in the United States, in the last Biden administration, they moved a little bit further to the right, encroaching on the traditional space of the Republican. But this creates a problem because traditionally the center-left around the world has been very sympathetic to issue of colonial legacy, development, and really managing how to channel resources to speed up development within the continent. So that is likely not to happen with the new administration and the challenges that are related to that in the world. The center-right seems to be really flirting with the far right. That's why the Likud party in Israel, which has been the center-right, has moved a bit to the far right and really setting up relations with the far right. The Labour Party in Israel is no longer existent. The Labour Party in the United Kingdom has moved a bit to the right, which really presents serious challenges in terms of dealing with developing countries, because the center-left, as I'm saying, has been very sympathetic to these issues. Let me conclude here really by raising this fundamental issue that I think within the continent, the leaders would have to deal with it. Our leaders in the continent will need to define the strategic niche that Africa has for the United States and work on that. But as I said, we're much more concerned about our own individual country instead of the holistic continent that provides close to more than about 1.3 billion people that it can become, and this is more than 1.3 billion, that is a young market, young entrepreneurs, really disruptors in many respects. And I think as we move forward in the next century, the development of Africa will be, the precedent for that will be set by these young Zs that are really disruptive, be it in Kenya, around in Ghana, in Nigeria, in South Africa. So there's a change that must be expected. Let me thank you for now.
Thank you, Your Excellency. The African Union officials have requested that each of you should just give them a page of your recommendation. in terms of how to deal with the new administration. Let me start by asking you 3 questions. One, you're a diplomat. You deal with body language. And I've also had the opportunity myself in international fora in dealing with body language. If you were to meet Trump, how will your body language be? Second, how do you convince somebody from Cameroon, or Nigeria, that US is a democracy? Because people are now posing the question, is this the kind of democracy they're talking about? And finally, I really love your point about the left has left. If the left has left, what ideology will now push a new set of conversation? Who is going to do the critique? Because the traditional conception of conversation is that radicals left and left of center will launch an attack. But who is going to launch this attack? Thank you.
Let me start with the left has left us. You know, I read a wonderful work by Bob Altmeyer, and he wrote a wonderful book, and it took him years to really unpack the center left, the left on left, the right on left, and the center right, and the right on right, and so on. Wonderful reading. That book essentially exposes the intolerance that you see within the left, within the right, and we're starting to see those elements. So we have no one to critique the right. And I think this is the space for academic, for civil society, to keep on managing the project spearheaded by the center right, in coalition sometimes with the far right, that is really bent on making profit at the expense of ordinary people. There is no sense of humanity in terms of the challenges that ordinary people are facing, poverty and so on around the world. So I think the academics and the civil society have a big role to play in managing the situation, because there's nothing that can be done. I mean, those who are on the left are actually moved even to the far right. I think it's Gramsci who said the shortest route to the right is by extreme left. So you have seen people who have been to the left, they've made it to the right and to the extreme right. I mean, really, Prof, to drive the point home in terms of this, you know, people like Paul Wolfowitz, they were Trotskyites, and Ronald Rumsfeld, they were Trotskyites, but they ended up moving to the far right and so on. So we are unlikely to see any change because of business driven. You may have seen Trump during the inauguration surrounded by big billionaires and trillionaires. So the $1 trillion that was behind Trump was basically saying to him, we are with you. You will recall there's an argument that when Hitler used to put his hand behind, he was extending his hand to business to say, give me the money, I'll do the fight. But Trump had them behind him. He would do the fight with them. That's one. The other question, Prof, that really relates to what the African Union are saying, we should make recommendations. I'm just afraid, and I'll be very blunt about this one. Raila Odinga was a good friend of mine. By the time he assumed positions, if he does win that, he'll be in his 80s. And you have young generation within the continent that are yearning for change. I'm not sure if you'll be able to make the change. So the African Union itself is left behind in terms of effecting change and streamlining gender issues and youth issues within its ranks. That's my biggest problem. What was your other question, Prof? You are muted.
Body language, and is the US a democracy?
The US, it is a democracy, I must say, because democracy does not go with what we think it's right or what we perceive it's right. Is a decision that is made the majority of the electorate. In this case, he did not win. He did not only win the electoral college, he even won the popular vote, which I think for quite some time, the Republicans have been struggling to win that. They are a democracy, and they've identified issues that they would like Trump to deal with them. Among them is this arbitrary deportation. That's what the Americans have decided. And I have seen information that, for instance, in California on Friday, 46% of workers didn't turn up. And it's known that the majority of farm workers, it's known that the majority of farm workers in the state of California are illegal migrants, and they are the ones who have been keeping the state economy functioning. In Texas, they're saying about 23% of farm workers didn't turn up. So that's what is going to happen. The body language that one would say Trump, if I were to have the opportunity to have this discussion with Trump, is basically to encourage him to let Africans spend their resources here. Most of our resources and our leaders, their resources are abroad. That's why they are quite quick to go for medical treatment abroad, because that's where they've stashed their money. And this money is required here. It's to bring that money back. There's been a commission set up by the AU that was led by President Mbeki to see how to repatriate the funds that have been looted, most of them. But not only looted, but there is savings that must be kept within the continent. I would urge him actually to put pressure on these leaders to send the money back before they could ask money from him. Unfortunately, I don't know if you've seen during the General Assembly last year, the German Chancellor and I think the Norwegian Prime Minister, they came in a small car. They shared a car going to the General Assembly. But most of the people who were there, African leaders, they went there with huge limousines, huge convoys. And these are the people who are asking money from this German. So there must be a change of consumption pattern between African leaders and leaders of the developed North. I think those are issues that I would support Trump to put pressure on our leaders to do more for the country than do more for themselves.
Thank you very much. I want to also recognize the ambassadors that I've recognized on Zoom. Ghana's ambassador to Venezuela. I've seen some member of embassy of US in Pretoria. I've seen the Uganda ambassador. Thank you for joining us. And once again, I thank the heads of state who are viewing this in their own private channel. They've now risen to 11, which means they've taken the Trump administration very seriously. Ayisah Osori, please direct your comments and questions to Kingsley.
Okay, thank you, Kingsley. I mean, this was really interesting. I would like to just say that on the left has left that you're absolutely right. This is the opportunity for civil society and academia. There's a sense that the language that we're using these days, whether it's about populism, authoritarianism, that language, those definitions don't quite fit the moment that we're in. And so we actually do need to be more creative, more intentional about defining and examining what's going on and even finding new vocabulary for those things. So thank you for that. And I agree with you, absolutely. The US is a democracy. When people point to Trump alone, I try and remind them that almost 80 million Americans are behind him. They voted for him. They like his policies. They want those policies. So we should stop making it seem as if Trump is some aberration. He's a product of the United States and their democracy. So thank you for that. I think my comment, despite the comment you made about the AU, I still want to go back to the AU. In his 2018 speech before the UN General Assembly, Trump said, moving forward, we're only going to give foreign aid to those who respect us and frankly, who we can call our friends. And it's very likely that he will take this track again. And this could influence everything from foreign policy, i.e. vote with us on China, Russia, Ukraine, etc., to adopt our culture wars around abortion rights, Christian fundamentalism, etc. And I still think that our response as a continent should be a collective one. So my question to you is, how can or should the AU and other regional blocs inoculate us from being dragged into these polarities? Once upon a time, the AU would take a foreign policy issue that all of Africa would adhere to, but that era seems to be over now. What would it take to rebuild that? Because it's necessary. Thank you.
Excellent.
Well, you know, Ayisah, there's a say that the one who calls the tune controls the piper. That has been the legacy and the weaknesses of the African state. I think there's been a lot of literature about the weaknesses of the African state and the level of dependency of the African state on the former colonial state. For instance, people in West Africa used to complain that to move from Nigeria to Senegal, they have to do it via Paris, and yet they are across. So those are the legacies that African leaders and the boundaries that the African leaders need to open up to deal with this issue. These are concrete issues that the African Union, I think, would have to deal with them on concrete basis. This issue that the African leaders would fly to Ukraine to try to resolve the Ukrainian conflict and leaving a conflict in the Sahel, leaving a raging conflict in the Sudan, I found it totally different. I was very critical of my own president here. And I said it quite openly in the media space to say, I find this very, really concerning that our taxpayers are used to fly there instead of resolving the continental problem. Until African leaders identify the biggest issue that is bedeviling the continent, which is conflict, and set up better institutional capacity to respond, early warning systems that are really meant to respond and deal with the challenges of the conflict. But as long as we don't have internal capacity, the dependency of this emerging multipolarity, because we've been dragged all sides, is the Africa-America summit, the Africa-China summit, the Africa-Russia summit, and so on. Until we identify exactly how do we need to interface with the world as Africa, the better. President Ruto was quite firm at one stage to say this thing of African leaders getting into a plane to go and see a single head of state, it doesn't make sense. Maybe it's better to send the chair of the African Union there to represent the entire continent. They have to identify those issues and define what they need to do. But I'm worried that the current crop of leadership within the continent, across the continent, I'm really worried. I'm not referring to you, Your Excellencies, who are watching. I'm just speaking in general terms. Thank you.
Carl, what do you want to tell Kingsley?
I have a couple of things on my mind, and I appreciated Ayisah's intervention too. And the symbolism of the billionaires behind Dr. Kingsley that Dr. Kingsley mentioned was important. We need to remember that Elon Musk donated $250 million to help Donald Trump get elected. But one of the interesting things is that many of the policies, including the tariffs from China, will hurt Musk's businesses tremendously. So, when there is this symbolism and this rhetoric around "we support you, Mr. President," there's also this effort of slowly lining up their ability to influence the administration in ways that serves their interests, their corporate interests. So that's one thing I wanted to start with, and I think that's germane to the discussion about rare earths. The other thing I wanted to react to is this, and maybe it's a little bit early in the conversation to bring this up, but the thought about recommendations and recommendations for African diplomats and others. One thing on my mind, and I think something that I learned from the overlap of my experience on Capitol Hill and also just thinking about the first Trump administration, is that typically, I think the way foreign governments and industries would work would be to build relationships with the key officials in the administration. So if you're concerned about tariffs, you build ties to the Department of Commerce and to the United States Trade Representative's office and so forth. The thing that we learned from the first Trump administration is that there's a lot of turnover and there's a lot of vacancies. So as an alternative strategy, what I would really suggest is to organize around with the industries and the interests who work around those officials. So in other words, when I worked on Capitol Hill, we would get letters all the time that were signed by 100, 200, 300 organizations or interests saying, hey, we disagree with this policy, or hey, we have an interest in seeing the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act extended. It's coalition work, but I think what that does is it will begin to facilitate a shift in power, and it'll remind American democracy that Ayisah was referring to, that power is also in society, and so I think I wanted to address all that, and the comments about the rise of the far right, in parts of the world, including Europe, is really alarming. Not to dwell on Elon Musk, but again, the things that he said about AfD in Germany are really quite concerning recently. But it's also heartening that some of the populist anti-democratic parties have recently lost in Europe. So there's a lot of work to do, but those are some of the things that are coming to my mind.
Carl, let me challenge you and His Excellency a little bit, and I will start with Carl. So years ago, you may not remember, under Buhari, he drafted a protest letter, which I signed, and people have been asking that you and I, we are eager to criticize the Nigerian president. But when it comes to the American president, how many petitions do we sign in opposing what they do? And there's a second question. Each time I go to northern Nigeria, they always ask me, how come American president, the question may not be well framed, do not criticize their own president as much as I and other Nigerian professors on a daily basis routinely hammer the Nigerian president. So, Your Excellency and Carl, I'm challenging the two of you. Please.
Prof, maybe if I may start, working the American system, it's very good to do petitions, to do all those kind of letters of protest and so on. In order to be very successful, it's basically the lobby. It's to lobby, and I've had an experience when I was with the anti-apartheid movement in the United States, is to work on the lobby of key senators who take decision and work on their constituencies. For instance, if you want the extension of AGOA, to go directly to Washington would not help, is to identify those who are involved and really start lobbying their constituencies to put pressures on their senators, on their elected officials. That I find very useful because they know they have to come for re-elections. It's good to write anything in public, but if you want an impact, I think the best way is to set up and spend resources to do lobby, because the United States, lobby in the United States works with money. That's why the Israeli lobby is so powerful, because they spend resources to lobby.
I live in DC and we call it the 14th Street. But would you advise an African country to spend its scarce resources on this approach? It's very expensive.
It's very expensive.
I thought when Obama left, he's going to set up a lobby group in New York. And I panicked. And I wrote to the AU that if he does this, nobody should consult him. Eventually, he didn't set up any lobby group. Would you advise a country like Mali or Nigeria, your scarce resources, take it to 14th Street? That's what we call them, 14th Street. It has the highest concentration of lobbyists in the world.
Absolutely. We had the Trans-Africa Lobby Group that was run by Randall Robinson, and may his soul rest in peace. It was a wonderful platform. And we needed to capacitate such platform. I think we need to identify a niche of conducting a lobby with scarce resources. If we better channel these resources and identify what is in the best interest of the continent, and not look at small and approach this very on parochial basis, but have a bigger picture in terms of what is that we need from the United States. Some of the things that we need is transfer of technology and better access to US market using our product. So you need to start working on those issues, that you want to compete with US products, but you need to spend your resources where your mouth is. And I think where the mouth is, when it comes to the US, do the lobby.
Your Excellency, my argument is since the fall of apartheid, all African countries, AU, we've not been able to identify a single issue that we can all agree to. Du Bois and Nkrumah agreed on decolonization, right? Later on, we agreed on the fall of apartheid. Since 1994, we've been struggling to get a theme, because you need a commonality of theme, and we have not been able to arrive at one. Some people have suggested that poverty, MKO Abiola suggested reparation, but we have not, there's no consensus. And until you arrive at a consensus, you cannot lobby.
Prof, that's the absence of leadership. That's where the big problem is. You know, take, for instance, the G20 that is coming here. That was in Brazil. It's coming to South Africa. It was in Brazil. You know, the global debt is 317 trillion, the global debt. And the global economy is $117 trillion. So you can see we're swimming in debt. And I was very critical, including our government, that we're not streamlining issues of global debt, how to manage this, because we have a huge, ambitious agenda for Africa. But we have no resources to meet that because we live on financing the debt. And I'm glad the South African government, it seems now, they're going to allow the discussion to go on the global debt. It doesn't only affect us. Out of that debt, Prof, I think the public sector owes about 117 trillion US dollars. So you can see we're swimming. Out of the 117 trillion, the US actually has 36 trillion. So the rest of it is divided amongst us. So you can see we're swimming in serious debt.
Thank you. Professor Isike, please comments on what His Excellency has said very quickly.
Well, I think he said the right things. I was just concerned about what Biden said. Before he left, I think the day before he left, he warned of the rise of the tech oligarchy, which Carl also referenced in America. I'm just worried about the implications of how their control over information would impact on misinformation and disinformation, and how that will affect elections in Africa and democracy broadly. Especially if you look at the role that Elon Musk played in this regard and what he's doing in Germany, which Carl also mentioned. That's the one concern I wanted to talk about, for Kingsley. The second question would be whether Kingsley would believe in the use of political tariffs. Okay, I call them political tariffs because Trump simply says, if you don't agree with me, I will tariff you. That's economic warfare he's talking about. But I'm asking Kingsley if he believes that Africa can use its numerical advantage as having the highest voting bloc in the UN General Assembly, for example, as a tool to also become reciprocal or transactional with Trump.
Well, with respect to how Africa can leverage and deal with this question of the tariffs, this is not unique to Africa. It's imposing same to Europe, some of his strategic allies, and so on. So you can see the man is looking at value in terms of any engagement. And that's where I say the opportunity, Chris, is for Africa is to design a policy that is mutually beneficial. The US gets something, we get something in return. But the absence of leadership to define what is mutually beneficial to the continent is a big problem. One of the issues that I think is to set up better institutional capacity to manage conflicts, because we're bedeviled by conflicts. We spend a lot of our resources in military and so on, and yet we could use these resources to deal with the real issues that are confronting, developmental issues. But with the respect of these emerging rich people who are likely to use disinformation, we've already seen it. The deep phase, it's playing a big role in terms of misinformation. We're also worried about the question of artificial intelligence. I had the privilege to participate in a think tank, a US-based think tank, Quincy Institute. And part of the things, if you look at that report from Quincy Institute that identifies It's the governance around the artificial intelligence. They can change your picture and put you somewhere else and advocate for that. And in rural communities, here, where people are dependent only on the cell phone and the data they get, and they have no time to verify what they are getting on their information, it's a big challenge. It's a big challenge even for analysts like myself. Each time I go on radio, on television here, I'm worried about the information at my disposal, and I try to go through a verification. And it takes long to do verification of information before you could speak to the public. So we're going to live with disinformation moving forward and the control. I mean, if you look at Facebook, they've removed one of the things they had on Facebook in terms of the verification of information. So any data that you put there would go. So it may raise a lot of lawsuits in certain countries. In the United Kingdom, sadly, it would do that. But it's a challenge that we have to manage. Do we have capacity to develop better governance for artificial intelligence within the continent? We don't. The Americans, in June last year, they started having a meeting with the Chinese because they're the only one who advanced in terms of starting to develop governance for artificial intelligence. So for artificial intelligence, it's good, but it's very rogue. It can create a lot of problems and havoc around the world.
Let me ask you the final question before we make the transition. Are we dealing with Machiavelli now? Because we have to confess, many countries are even afraid. We're not talking about individuals. Individuals are afraid, and countries are afraid. In all previous interviews, I will have announced the countries who join, the radio stations, the television. But they're saying, please don't announce us. Is this Machiavelli?
Can I jump in?
Please jump in. Jump in, Carl.
I'm more worried about George Orwell than I am about Machiavelli.
Okay.
This week, the President of the United States issued an executive order called Restoring Freedom of Speech and Ending Government Censorship. This morning, I went to the United States Department of Justice website to review the status of January 6 pardons and the investigations of nearly 1,600 defendants to just see how did the Department of Justice close out these cases now that many of these defendants have been granted clemency or a presidential pardon. And I want to mention that 161 of those defendants assaulted law enforcement. 943 of them pleaded guilty. 10 people were found guilty or pleaded guilty to seditious conspiracy, a very serious charge. And when you go there now, or when you go to the Department of website's website, it links to information about Customs and Border Patrol incidents and the interdiction of migrants. The information no longer exists on the United States Department of Justice's website. It might be somewhere archived in the United States government websites, but it's not searchable. And when you search within the Department of Justice website, there's information missing. Now, the reason why this is important, I think, for the listeners and our friends in Africa, is that I think it's hard to organize against police violence as the End SARS movement did, as the Black Lives Matter movement did, when the president of a country can just say that it's okay to pardon people who were convicted of crimes for police violence. It makes violence against the state a legitimate form of political activity. And so, I think this also speaks to some of our earlier, conversation about, is the United States still a democracy? And I think it's really important to note that Biden and Harris, Harris ultimately is the candidate, conceded the election, but we also need to watch rule of law in these other areas. So.
Thank you.
I think you're seeing some element of Machiavellian that is starting to manifest itself on global stage. The whole thing, and a very righteous argument that the only way to prevent a war is to prepare for a war. That really increases the arms race, and that's what we're starting to see. Unless the Trump administration does something in terms of dealing with these issues. the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty has come to an end and has basically collapsed. Now, Trump did make mention about, he called denuclearization. I think he wanted to speak about the limitation of nuclear arms. So you're starting to see those elements. And the whole concept of raison d'histoire, it's coming to the face now, that the state will do whatever it takes to protect its interests, including invading foreign countries. So you're starting to see those elements, not only by the Americans, it's becoming prevalent. Also, the Russians are starting to do the same thing and so on. So we're facing a serious challenge. And I only hope that between Trump and Putin, they'll be able to make a deal in terms of all these arms treaties that were in place and see how to revive them and so on. If we don't do that, the arms race, we are on it. And small countries are going to spend whatever little resources they are having to protect what they perceive as a threat.
Thank you. It's my honor and privilege to invite Ayisah Osori. She's appeared on our program. This will be her third time. She went to the University of Lagos, one of their best students ever. She went to Harvard Law School and Harvard Kennedy School. And she's been serving in private development, nonprofit sectors for over 20 years. Talking about business development, regulation and compliance, general management. She's currently based in London as the director in Open Society Foundation's Ideas Workshop. And this is a grant-making and advocacy organization. She ran for election in Nigeria. She lost, unfortunately. And she wrote a book on that loss, Love Does Not Win Elections. And I've read the book. I've invited her to Austin to present the book. And it's a very major book. If you have not read it, I recommend it. Ayisah, it's your turn now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Thank you for inviting me. And again, let me say hello to everyone who's joined in. This is almost past the hour of our conversations now. And thank you too. It's really a pleasure to be here with Carl, Christopher, and Dr. Kingsley. So I want to sort of take a different track to what we've been talking about and think about some of the opportunities that come from the assortment of risks, threats, and openings. And there are many risks and many threats, as we've heard from Carl and Kingsley, especially as we think about the Africa and Donald Trump's second term. But in order to do that, in order to talk about the opportunities, I think it's first I have to paint a picture of some of what we have going for us in Africa, and then tie some of the opportunities to these perceived risks, threats, and openings, some of which we've already talked about this evening. Now, some of what Africa has going, and this by no means is an exhaustive list. We have, in 2023, we had $90 billion in remittances to Africa coming from the diaspora. So we do have money coming in. Right now, Africa only contributes 4% of greenhouse gas emissions, which means we can do something meaningful about energy poverty by focusing on natural gas. So for instance, if we tripled our electricity generation using only gas, the additional emissions to the world would be less than 1%. So the good news is that we have lots of room to generate and use a lot more energy without contributing to global warming. Third, we're in the middle of a post-COVID recovery growth, and expectations are that 44 African countries will grow faster than the global average of 3.2%. Among the best performers in West Africa are Benin, Cote d'Ivoire, and Senegal, with Uganda, Rwanda, and Tanzania in the east and Zimbabwe in the south. Fourth, we can also expect increased foreign direct investments, barring any wars, obviously, in the Middle East and Europe. 5, we can take the weakening of France's political, military, and social influence on the continent, particularly in West Africa, as an opportunity for the development of a relationship of equals and less, hopefully, neocolonial meddling, a cue for ECOWAS, and hopefully maybe some real investments. And then 6th, we see increasingly Africa's soft power in the world through culture, arts, expression, literature, and so on and so forth. Now, What are the threats and the concerns in the context of a second Trump presidency? There's the war in Sudan, obviously, the growing tensions in DRC, which Dr. Kingsley mentioned, and the general insecurity of jihadists spreading violence across the Sahel. We also will have tensions in East Africa should Trump decide to recognize Somaliland, as many analysts are suspecting that he might, as a way of checkmating China. Third, the poor economic policy making and youth unemployment that we generally suffer across Africa. According to analysts, we have 10 million young Africans entering the workforce every year, yet the region's economies are barely producing 3 million jobs per year. We also have shrinking space for dissent and very weak public sector accountability. And we can expect to see even more internal instability as citizens push back against these realities, especially as inflation and economic growth slows for people in their pockets. And we saw examples of that in Kenya last year and the protests in Nigeria as well. And then fifth, we're not taking global warming seriously, not focused on the right policies and engagement with a view to adaptation and resilience, despite the effects that we are already experiencing with floods, changing rain patterns, pests, droughts, and so on. And this lack of practical concern could be exacerbated with an American president who says climate change is a hoax. So what are the opportunities? One, Trump has already pulled out of the Paris Accord, and it's clear that oil and gas is going to be made great again, if there was any doubt. What this means for us in Africa, where multilateral banks have pushed for the adoption of anti-growth decarbonization strategies that could keep us energy poor, is that we can push a natural gas agenda. Natural gas could be a transition fuel for low-income countries and could open investment and financing opportunities to exploit gas for power generation and domestic use. Africa has lots of gas, accounting for up to 40% of all natural gas discoveries between 2010 and 2020. And at the moment, however, the region barely uses gas, with 82% of our domestic consumption of natural gas concentrated in 3 countries alone: Egypt, Algeria, and Nigeria. So investing in gas could be an opportunity, especially if, as Ken Opalo advises, we tie this to aggressive requirements for minimum levels of domestic use to ensure that we get to use the gas on the continent and not send it abroad to subsidize the gas consumption of high-income countries. So that's the first opportunity. The second is, as we read the tea leaves, because that's what everybody's doing around the world, trying to project what might happen with a Trump presidency, we can definitely refuse to be dragged into any polarities between China and Russia, which we've been by and large successfully doing over the last couple of years. We must remember Nkrumah's caution to face neither east nor west, but face forward. And forward is the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Let's focus on that, including building on leisure tourism, which we're beginning again to see a pickup, especially with the younger generation, as well as industrial policy cooperation, self-sufficiency, and a stronger integration of the continent. Third, as development aid stops or reduces, African entrepreneurs and innovators seem confident that the United States might favor instead building private sector bonds over the traditional development assistance. They argue that there's an opportunity for competitive business-driven model which could promote self-sufficiency and job creation. So this is an opportunity for a more commercial relationship with the US, paired possibly with better coordination of the US agencies under the Prosper Africa, which is also something that people are talking about. Fourth, while it would be undoubtedly very painful, especially for public health, to lose funding for development and aid, civil society and active citizens could also look at the reduction of development aid as an opportunity to strengthen and legitimize citizens' voices and demands for public accountability, which is critical to protecting and nurturing the democracy that we're sort of evolving with. While the EU has been a steady donor, the US still remains the number one. One hopes that the EU will continue, but the truth is the impact of a Trump presidency could also result in less EU donor aid, as they too deal with the need to increase defense spending and manage Russia-US aggression. If during this period of reduced aid, we see more citizen engagement on public goods and social economic rights, then we neutralize, hopefully for good, the lazy accusation from governments who try to constantly discredit citizens' voices by claiming foreign interference through funding. Social media, a double-edged sword, admittedly, still provides the platform to be creative about holding these conversations and making demands of our governments to hold their feet to the fire about social, economic, and political demands. And then, fifth opportunity, it sounds terrible to say this, but African countries could plan for a possible war in the Middle East. With the confirmation of Peter Hegseth as Secretary of Defense, known for his pro-Israel Zionist views, confrontation with Iran is very likely, and this could trigger an increase in global oil prices, which will also result in inflationary pressures on many economies. And we can prepare for these two eventualities if we start planning now. For instance, for Nigeria to be able to prepare for any possible increase in oil prices, it will need to do two things. It will need to end widespread oil theft, and it will need to improve its inadequate infrastructure. Otherwise, it will be prevented from increasing production and benefiting from the higher global prices. So this is the type of preparation that countries need to start thinking about. To close, to take advantage of these opportunities, it will be contingent on African states' capacity to, one, successfully coordinate efforts as a unit. There's strength in unity. Two, to preserve social and political stability within their borders by making the right economic, social, and political policies and managing public funds prudently. This is not the time, if it ever was, for selfish multi-million refurbishments of official residences and official foreign trip jamborees, which Dr. Kingsley also brought up. And three, we need to be more methodical and intentional about steady development, particularly investments in health, education, and social public goods. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Two Excellencies said they've not heard anything about China and Wagner. And they were saying, please, can you talk about those? Ayisah can do that. Another, yes, please, Carl, go ahead.
I'll let Ayisah go first.
No, please, because I was going to say China and Wagner. I mean, maybe Professor Fadala needs to hold another dialogue specifically on that. That could take the whole 2 hours. In thinking about the US, I didn't think about China and Wagner. I mean, they've existed. China's engagement with Africa is, in my opinion, very welcome, considering that it provides a buffer from us being too reliant on the West, in quotes. And I think, again, individually, many African countries have done their best to straddle the line between managing a relationship with China and managing a relationship with the US. It will get more difficult, I think. There's definitely statements that Trump has made, I think already warning BRICS against trying to engage in transactions without using the dollar, or sort of sidelining the dollar, already warning people, countries in the BRICS coalition not to do that. So those are some of the things that we know are going. There's a sense that Wagner's influence, while at some point very, what's the word, impactful, particularly in the Sahel region, that since Prigozhin was killed, that influence has waned. But I'll let you step in, Carl, because that's not an exact question for me, but go ahead.
Yeah, so I think this is a really important question. You're probably right that this, warrants its own broader conversation. There is definitely some question about Wagner's influence declining in the Sahel in some way. I have some research with two colleagues from American University coming out later this year, looking at the impact of China and Russia in Africa across 14 countries on the continent since 2014. And, at the outset of my comments, I mentioned that 69% of Africans support democracy, and some of that support is quite strong, and it's really important. But one of our core findings is that once you're looking across a broad range of authoritarian influence efforts by China and Russia, with Russia's activities in particular, and I'm not just talking about disinformation, I'm talking about a whole range of activities, that support for democracy declines. So the effect is weaker when it comes to China. And I think that is important for the US government to hear. And this is one of my many responses to the earlier question about why don't you ever question your own government, which is, just not the way Americans think about democracy at all. I'm a fan of Pippa Norris's work, where she says that skepticism and democracy go hand in hand. But again, a core finding is that Russian activities undermine African support for African self-governance and democracy. And I think that's very concerning. On the US side, what's really important, and I think for civil society organizations devoted to peace and justice, is that there's a fair amount of bipartisan support for the rising animosity towards China. Biden continued most of the Trump tariffs on China when Biden came into office. Indeed, this week, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee is having a hearing on China and its influence. And so, I think part of our responsibility as activists, as scholars, and as global citizens of democracy, that we want to make sure that there are opportunities for de-escalation, and that we're not blurring together, some of the different effects of Africa and China on the continent. Indeed, some of the research on China's involvement with the Belt and Road Initiative suggests that in some countries, the growth of African economies actually goes up. So it's a complex picture, but it's less complex when it comes to Russia. And in that regard, I think I'm hoping the Trump administration can have an honest and direct approach about that, and that this comes up in Trump's conversations with President Putin that he referenced over the last couple of days.
Thank you.
If I may just chip in on China.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah, so I think that, many of the things Carl said about the surveys, including even the last Afrobarometer surveys, perceptions of young people towards China and the US, interestingly, there is affinity or support towards these countries, including even Russia. But interestingly, the Afrobarometer surveys show that there is more acceptance towards the United States, despite all of that. So that's important. But I think China will be a critical factor in Trump's engagement with Africa, principally because of the need to contain China and to counter it in Africa. That will be huge. And a point I want to make relative to this is the fact that if Trump goes ahead with his tariffs on China, I know he's talked about 10%. If it's anything higher than that and China can't tolerate it, Africa could become an opportunity, to divert its markets to. And that is something that I'm sure the Trump administration will be wary of. And maybe it presents an opportunity also for Africa, to begin to organize itself better economically and collectively in order to leverage some of these opportunities that may come if China decides to turn to Africa, because its products can't go to America anymore.
Can I also
go ahead, please? Go ahead.
Just very briefly, I really agree with what my colleagues are saying about China and so on. But what really took me by surprise during the summit of the African heads of state in China, China decided to reconfigure the relationship in what they call a comprehensive strategic partnership in the new era. And I've been struggling to find anyone to define what is this new era? What are the components of this new era? And it tells you, it comes back to leadership. Our leaders are quite happy to sign these things and agree without defining the new era. And this new era, if it's an era of the contestation for African resources and African minds and so on, it will be unfortunate, because you need to define and open up about this discussion. That's one thing. But I entirely agree with other issues they've raised. But with respect to Wagner Group involvement in the continent, there's always a need for mercenaries around. The United States have their own paramilitary group that they send to Iraq, they send all over the world where the state can act. and you would see the civil militia groups are actually used in cases where the state realizes much more exposed to a lot of international law challenges. And they're quite quick to use that. South Africa has been a battleground. You know, you recall that there were a lot of mercenaries that were brewed and trained here in South Africa. So once you deal with the sources of security instability in the continent, you deal with the question of the need for civil militia groups or mercenaries around. Deal with the sources of the conflict. And sources of the conflict requires leadership and to develop strategies that will resolve this conflict, and you won't have any need for mercenaries. It's a long-term arrangement, but you need to start now.
Ayisah, what will you tell people that your opportunities translate to exploitation?
Sorry?
What will you tell a young student at the University of Ibadan that the opportunities you outlined will translate to exploitation?
Exploitation of who? Of them?
Of Africa.
Well, I mean, I don't think it necessarily has to if we are mindful about how we engage. I mean, so for example, a lot has been said about the transaction-mindedness of Donald Trump. And many have tried to couch that as something that's a overall positive thing. But the truth is we should be wary of that transaction-ness of his, because we might find that transaction-ness and his out of the deal type of mentality could result in many deals in Africa that would benefit oligarchs, of which we already have many, that would benefit individual businessmen, just like the tech bros that he has behind him. And then there would be no trickle-down effect on the public. We could see, as there already a competition for mineral resources across Africa, especially these rare metals that Democratic Republic of Congo has a lot of. So yes, there could be exploitation, but this is where the intentional that we need, the intentional focus on making sure, as the Prof just pointed, as His Excellency pointed out a few minutes ago, that when these deals are being made, when African leaders are signing these deals, or when our businessmen are signing these deals, because we could find in a very short time that we're finding many businessmen on the continent going to America, lobbying and doing deals that don't benefit us. So who is going to be looking at these deals? This is the opportunity for not just civil society, but all citizens, lawmakers as well. So it could be, in answer, that one might be exploited, but it could be that also, if we're intentional, as we are now, having these conversations and having the ears of policymakers, advisors, that it will not necessarily be exploitative. How would it be exploitative to be able to get a natural gas deal that allows us to have more clean energy? Africa is one of the most energy poor continents maybe even the most in the world. We need energy. The fact that we've had this, because of climate change, this push from development agencies to move away from what they call carbon fossil fuels and move towards green energy, which is very expensive for us. With Trump now, there is an opportunity to go back to talking about financing natural gas. So I would say it's not a straightforward answer.
So what about issues around destabilization? The Syrian option, in which you fund insurgencies to crash the government. Possibilities in the Sudan, possibilities in the Sahel, funding jihadists to overthrow the states, destabilizing Nigeria using Boko Haram, and so many examples. These are avenues that any government can explore to destabilize nation states. What do you think about that?
I think it comes down again to leadership. What our leaders, the people, the presidents, heads of state, their many, many advisors are doing to prevent these types of things, to put mitigating factors into place. One of the things that we can do, obviously, is better awareness, more intentionality about making sure people know. I know there's a deep reliance on social media, for example, but if let's go back to Nigeria and the Sahel is a place where I think millions of people speak Hausa language. While many of us, the elite, are on social media, many people still rely on the radio for conversations and for information. That's harder to manipulate with AI, hopefully, because it's not yet visual. You're not sort of transposing people's faces over voices and things like that. So yeah, we have to be creative. We have to sort of think outside the box in terms of inoculating ourselves from misinformation. But misinformation is here to stay. Everybody's trying to manage as best as they can. I would say this is the time for the AU, the regional blocs like ECOWAS, SADC to come together, to put things aside. We have heard earlier today that it's very hard for us to find common themes, but maybe a survival as common theme right now is something that should be on the table. My recommendation is that as much as possible, AU and the regional blocs should be meeting and picking out these things, these threats, and talking about how they plan to deal with them. Whether they're going to disagree, they should spend time debating, talking about the ideas, have advisors there, have academics, have civil society, have experts there, technocrats, have these debates, and then come up with, through compromise, on the positions that they need to take as a bloc. But I think, honestly, if we continue to think about the threats and the risks to the continent in piecemeal, you can't talk about Boko Haram without talking about the wider Sahel issue, without even talking about Libya, without talking about what's happening with the jihadists and who's funding them and where the funding is coming from. So talking about these things in piecemeal or as single issues is not going to help.
Okay, thank you very much. It's now my pleasure to go ahead, please. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I'm just worried. I hope what Trump announced, that the transnational criminal syndicates will be categorized as terrorists, would create a huge problem. For instance, for students of conflict resolution like me, because there's a process that you follow in terms of analyzing particular groups. And I hope it was just a slippery of the tongue that you won't implement that in the definition, because once you start to blur the line between transnational criminal syndicates and terrorists, then you're running into a serious problem. Having said that, I think what we need to deal with within the continent, I'm of the view, Prof, that really looking into the root causes of conflict. Once a conflict has flared up, it means there's a failure. In diplomacy, we always say a conflict it's a failure of diplomacy. So there's something that has failed in terms of finding early solutions to the conflict. So there's a need to develop institutional capacity to deal with those issues.
And if I may just make a comment on this, it's not a question that Ayisah needs to answer now because of time. To answer Kingsley straightforward now, is said this thing 3 times: the root causes of conflict, the root causes of conflict. The root causes of conflict is poor governance, simple and short, right? Now, Ayisah mentioned potentials of Africa, which are huge, and they're all correct. We know them. But it's making me wonder, is it that our leaders, our policymakers, don't know these potentials, don't know these things? The fact of the matter is that they do. Many of them are very, very highly educated people. So the question of why, despite their knowledge, why, despite their visitation to foreign countries, including the United States, they are sojourn in these countries, when they come back home, they seem to have amnesia about the right things to do based on what they've seen. And I wasn't going to say this, but I think that when I hear Kingsley talk, when I hear you talk, the question, especially now that I'm aware that heads of states are here, I'm going to have to say this, that we need to grapple with the question of the states and governance in Africa. Okay, because we inherited a colonial conception of states. These things we call states are actually contraptions that were created for us, that were imposed on us. And the major mistake we've made in Africa is a failure to actually engage with the purpose of why these things were created. They were created as exploitation machines, not development machines. And until we have a sit down and discuss around the purpose of the state, why they were created, and whether we need to repurpose them and address the question of the social contract, which do not exist in Africa, we will keep asking these questions about the potentials that fail to materialize because of poor governance that then result in conflict and dependencies that make us, sit here and talk about what American presidents will do and will not do and what possibilities exist. It's just a comment I thought
Chris,
I should make.
Let me stop you just for courtesy purposes. The head of state sent me a message saying, why is it that African scholars don't give advice? They just abuse, insult, and criticize.
Well, I'm going to give advice when I start talking. That's why I use this opportunity to criticize first and then come back to the advice.
We've all given advice, actually. We started, the opportunities are a form of advice. It's left to them to take it.
I think he's
I
talking,
absolutely agree with you.
generally.
Yeah, but we're also talking generally. People always give recommendations, and I absolutely agree with Christopher. The truth is there is no social contract, but then, and maybe it's the opportunity, and maybe this is a nihilist view, but if the US butts out and takes its aid and doesn't bring it back, will the gap that it creates in terms of the buffer with its social goods and its support for public health, if all that goes away, will it make Africans, citizens, sort of wake up and sort of demand more of their own? Because the truth is, Christopher, yes, we know that our leaders, such as they are, understand these things. They go abroad, they know what's good, they're smart, they're educated, but doesn't translate into the policies we see at home. But we should also worry about the fact that there doesn't seem to be as much demand. Yes, when we do come out and demand, we get shot at, we get killed, people are disappeared. So it's violent, it's dangerous. But the truth is, if we had more people agitating, then it's harder.
Let me stop you. There's a response.
Yeah.
One excellent said, it's no longer on social media. He doesn't read them. That they're always very negative, and he's removed himself from all social media. I think Tinubu also said that in Nigeria. That doesn't. So I'm just reading. They have my priority because of their position. Yes, Kingsley?
On the first question, Prof.
Yeah.
It's a systemic problem. Okay. It's the utilization of academia.
You worked with Mandela before. Were you always criticizing him, or what were you doing?
I just want to define a broader picture of how the academia is better utilized. And unfortunately for Your Excellencies, that the United States has a better model of utilizing academia. They bring them as technocrats in specific policy issues, and they utilize them. They work for the administration, or when they leave, they go back to universities to go and teach. So there's a knowledge that circulates and experience that goes around to develop new knowledge. Take, for instance, a country like Qatar that has developed institutional capacity to mediate in very complex conflict, the Taliban and Americans and so, very small country. Do we have that institutional capacity, and do we utilize academia in that manner? Do we see academics as a threat? I always say people who have immunities.
Let me stop you. One question came that when you talk to us as tribalists.
As
tribalists. This is from a head of state.
No, I never spoke about tribalism.
It's not you. It's saying when scholars come to me, my office, they are talking as tribalists.
Now, Your Excellency, a research has been done in terms of how tribe or how ethnicity is used in politics. People are born, it's a primordial approach, are born with a particular tribe, a particular language, a particular race. The only time that is used is when it comes to elections, unfortunately. And people who are using that's why there's an argument that ethnicity is used as an instrument.
From Uganda, he said, you call me Tutsi, but you want me to listen to you.
The identity remains. It's a primordial thing. The fact that somebody's an Igbo, that's a language they speak, you can't take it away. But being an Igbo, it does not define you as in relation to Nigeria. You have an interest in terms of building the state in Nigeria. You can't always be identified as an Igbo. You've got to be identified as a Nigerian until you start speaking that. It's a primordial approach. It's something that somebody's born with. You can't take it away.
Sorry, well, more questions. Let me invite Professor Isike to take the stage. in the interest of time, and I'm happy that the questions from all heads of states are many, and I'm happy they're enjoying this conversation, and they're also relaying their own side of the position. The Tutsi question is important, that if you call me a Tutsi, why should I listen to you when you come to my office? So Professor Isike is a colleague of mine. I'm a professor of political science, University of Pretoria, where he's also my boss, my head of department, and he's also majors in international relations. He developed a graduate program in that. It's a privilege. I teach once a year in his department and his class. Years ago, I suggested that instead of having African studies in African universities, why can't they create a department of Western studies? I went to UI, I went to places saying, why don't you study the people you want to interact with? And today, I'm happy that we have the third center in the continent for the study of the United States. And Professor Isike is the founding director of the African Center for the Study of the US, and is the current president of the African Association of Political Science. He's been a consultant to major organizations, and he just completed his 4-year term as a social cohesion advocate of South Africa, appointed by the Minister of Sports, Arts and Culture. Please make your presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the generous introduction. I will start with a question that was asked me by one or two colleagues who called in when the advert for these interviews went out. The question was, why do we have to spend time talking about and analyzing US presidents every 4 years? And my answer to him, which I'm giving to everyone here, is that presidents have a huge impact on the implementation of the foreign policy of their countries. And it is particularly so in the US, as we have seen in the last 8 years. And what the US does in its position as a world leader affects Africa, whether we like the United States or not. So I thought that was important to say. Now, we have heard of Trump's transactional approach to foreign policy, guided by his America First doctrine, which explains his preference for bilateral engagement. Now, in terms of implications for Africa, many have projected that this would mean Trump abandoning, collective engagement platforms such as AGOA and the US-Africa Leaders Summit to pursue, bilateral trade deals, security cooperation, and political relations with countries that have something to offer him or the US, assuming that it's really, about the US, not him, right? Now, the question, therefore, is what should Africa do? Should we jostle, amongst ourselves to appeal to Trump for his choosing, or we can define our own agenda to force Trump to engage on Africa's own term? Now, I advise the latter, that is, us deciding and trying to force Trump to engage with us based on our own terms. And the African Union, through the African Union Commission, has a big role, to play here. And this is why I'm going to talk about, recommendations, specifically. Now, the African Union remains our best machinery for exercising collective agency, okay? Because we, as individual states, we will just simply be cherry-picked by the United States, and especially by transactional president or like Trump. Now, but the AU has to be prepared, for that. Like, Ayisah said, and Kingsley also. Now, it has done some good things in terms of structural and policy reforms for Africa's development broadly, but there's still a lot to do, especially since Africa still does not have a policy or strategy, for engaging superpowers and emerging powers like Turkey, like the Gulf states, that have, been cutting the continent through summit diplomacy in the last 15 years or so. Now, given the role that the African Union Commission, has in coordinating and harmonizing policies between the AU and member states, and of course the 8 regional economic communities we have in the continent, I want to suggest maybe 3 or 4 agenda items for the new African Union Commission chair whenever that election happens later this year. Now, for me, that new African Union Commission chair, whether it is Odinga, whether it is Gyan Yusa or Radramandratu, they need to immediately focus on coordinating functions of his office and the commission, and 3 things that he can do within a year, you know, to shore up our collective agency as Africa, or of Africa as a region, include 1, finalizing the division of labor between the AU and the regional economic communities. Okay, there's a lot of duplications. The necessary policy documents and the related practices are not yet in place. And there are constant contradictions in various policy feeds. Now, this is particularly true in peace and security, but also in trade. And for me, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which Ayisah referenced, is just one of the many examples. Now, the second area where I think is important for them to focus on, for him to focus on, is to increase the number of common African positions on key global issues. So it's not correct that since 1994 we've not had agreement on certain issues, maybe at the ideological level, but there's been a lot of common African positions that have been taken by the AU, and on very important global challenges. And one of them is the Ezulwini Consensus on the Reform of the United Nations Security Council and climate change, women in politics. Africa has contributed significantly as non-entrepreneurs through the AU, and it's important to acknowledge this. Now, it is currently also developing an extremely important position on the nexus between climate change and peace and security, which will eventually diffuse into another global norm, even though we're going to have an American president that does not necessarily support a common African position. But the point I'm making is that the common African positions are important for making an impact in international forums such as the United Nations, the G20, which the AU has just become a member of just 2 years ago. But it needs to develop more, including an immediate, a common African position on Africa-US relations, not US-Africa relations, Africa-US relations. We don't have an Africa-US strategy and policy, and that leaves us in a disadvantaged position of constantly being a recipient of development benefits that we have no input, in designing. So for me, such a common African position would be very useful to counter and engage Trump's cherry picking of Africa for US benefits alone. So that means that a common African position on how Africa engages the US will offer a systematic approach, to the AU strategic partnership with the US, defining the continent's broad areas of interest and needs, including a policy template and engagement with the US that has monitoring and evaluation framework for partnerships. This is crucial because there's been a lot of summit diplomacies in Africa, including between the US and Africa, but there is no monitoring and evaluation framework for monitoring how these things eventually progress, apart from what academics do. And we've said here that the governments in Africa never listen to us. Not all, but most of them don't. The last point I want to make is for them to complete the financial and institutional reform of the African Union. Now, we know that this started in 2016, but it is yet to be completed almost 10 years later. There has been progress in restructuring the AU Commission, for example, but financial reform needs to be completed immediately, as the financial dependency of the AU and its operations on external partners raises very serious questions around ownership, around commitment and autonomy of the AU. So, for example, AU member states and African institutions contribute, I think 41%, almost 42% of the estimated expenditure, and this is mainly on salaries and maintenance. And international partners, pay a whooping 58% of the annual budget for programs, implementation, and peace building activities. So this needs to change if the African Union or if Africa as a collective is to engage successfully with a transactional president like President Trump. I would end with an agenda for a couple of big states in Africa. So despite the trappings of modernization and representational progress we see in Africa, nothing has actually changed in the continent since political independence in terms of the roles that have been defined for us in the international economic system. And these three roles essentially, and scholars have mentioned this, are the role Africa plays as producers of raw materials for the developed world, as consumers of industrial outputs, and then also as dumping ground for obsolete techs, outsourced to us under development aid that locks us under the value chain. And now this needs to change. And now is the time to take concrete steps, towards making sure that this changes. Now, the African Union could coordinate cooperative regional leadership, what I call group hegemonic leadership, driven by states such as South Africa, Nigeria, Egypt, Algeria, Ethiopia, Kenya, Rwanda, and Botswana, just to mention a few, to craft a collective position for Africa to engage with superpowers, not just the US, the EU, China, Russia, and the Gulf states. There is need for coordinated initiatives on issues, including continental free trade area, thank God for the AFTA, intra-African tourism and industrial policies. So if it is possible for 10 African countries to share, for instance, an industrial policy, a policy on trade and an energy policy, that will help us, come out together as a collective, in terms of how we can engage with a transactional president like Trump. So there are areas where we can, again, and this is specific recommendations, areas where we can create comparative advantage to reduce our vulnerability to the ups and downs that happens in Washington, D.C. or any superpower capital for that matter. One of them is, on African higher education. South Africa, it used to be Nigeria in the 60s and 70s and maybe 80s. That has changed now to South Africa. It's now the education tourism spot for the continent. We can come together and make comparative advantage around higher education. Ethiopia also has the Peace University, and then recently we've had the African School of Governance, a postgraduate school for governance in Kigali. We also need to think about an African hospital or world-class medical facility. And it can start with building a world-class medical university financed by a $10 million annual contribution from each of the AU member states. Within 20 years, if we can do this, a valuable network of regional medical centers would have emerged such that our leaders will stop going to America, will stop going to Europe to get themselves for medical checkups or get ear infection treated, when they can simply, come together and create world-class hospitals that can, help to treat them. I will stop here at this stage and then hope that maybe I can talk more about this during the question and answer sessions.
Thank you very much. Please bring all the panelists back. The head of states wants Ayisah to answer this question, that in preparing to listen to this, he requested all the publications and writings of all of you and read that of Ayisah, and wants to know, why don't you think that preserving the unity of the country is far more important than this economy you all talk about? That if the countries break up, as you see in Sudan, the fight in Ethiopia, is that not bringing everything back? Is the issue of ethnic integration not far more important than gender issues and infrastructure issues? It's an important question. All of you can answer it. Why do you privilege these other issues more than the unity of these countries?
Thank you, Prof. And thank you to the president who shared that question. I agree, it's a very important question. And I'd start with saying I hate to think that anything I've written or said implies that I think the unity of any country in Africa is not important, despite the fact that we've already heard from Christopher that obviously our states are colonial imperial constructs. But we'll leave that philosophical, ideological conversation for another day and just focus on the meat and potatoes of this question. But no, identity issues, whether gender, whether ethnicity, whether religion, should not trump the unity of any country. But the truth is, what we have experienced in many of our countries is that ethnicity, religion, are often used as weapons by politicians and people who want to be in power to use that to divide citizens. And so usually the reaction of citizens is based on what has been sown. It's almost like you put seeds and this is what grows. So no, it's not, gender isn't more important. But the truth is, if you have any sector of any section, any population of any community, any country that's sidelined or treated as second-hand citizens for whatever reason, whether it's their gender, whether it's their religion, whether it's their ethnicity, they will be unhappy. And it will breed unhappiness. There's nothing I have written. I come from Nigeria, if that's not clear from my background. If there's nothing that I have written, there's nothing that journalists and writers have written that is more insidious than the types of comments that we've heard from politicians. If I use a former president, Buhari, who talks about the 95% and 9%, which sounds like a comment that Trump could make. He was making that comment in line with the fact that this 95% vote, he got 95% of his votes from one section, and he's not going to pay attention to the people where he got only 5%. When this leader should actually be saying, all Nigerians are my people, and all Nigerians are going to get the best of my administration and my governance. So no, I actually think that this is a very disingenuous question, and maybe it's even a bit of a distraction, because as Toni Morrison said, one of the distractions of racism is that it makes you sort of try and answer questions instead of getting on with the work. The truth is, it would be nicer to hear from the presidents on the call what interesting recommendations they've taken from the conversations today, as opposed to sort of poking holes and saying, what have you said in the past? The truth is, we want Africa to succeed. We want our countries to succeed. And that's why we're all here spending time having this conversation today. Thank you. And I'd look forward to my other colleagues adding more to this question.
Okay. So
Yeah.
we want to, 1 second. I want to bring in the audience before I lose them. Audience, raise your hands if you want to talk. I know we cannot be here all day. I will call on you. But before I start the audience, let's play a small video so that our panelists can take a 1 minute of rest before they are bombarded with very difficult questions. 1 minute of rest.
Since this is the last speech that I will give as president, I think it's fitting to leave one final thought, an observation about a country which I love. It was stated best in a letter I received not long ago. A man wrote me and said, "You can go to live in France, but you cannot become a Frenchman. You can go to live in Germany or Turkey or Japan, but you cannot become a German, a Turk, or Japanese. But anyone from any corner of the earth can come to live in America and become an American." Yes, the torch of Lady Liberty symbolizes our freedom and represents our heritage, the compact with our parents, our grandparents, and our ancestors. It is that lady who gives us our great and special place in the world. For it's the great life force of each generation of new Americans that guarantees that America's triumph shall continue unsurpassed into the next century and beyond. Other countries may seek to compete with us, but in one vital area, as a beacon of freedom and opportunity that draws the people of the world, no country on earth comes close. This, I believe, is one of the most important sources of America's greatness. We lead the world because, unique among nations, we draw our people, our strength, from every country and every corner of the world. And by doing so, we continuously renew and enrich our nation. While other countries cling to the stale past, here in America, we breathe life into dreams, we create the future, and the world follows us into tomorrow. Thanks to each wave of new arrivals to this land of opportunity, we're a nation forever young, forever bursting with energy and new ideas, and always on the cutting edge, always leading the world to the next frontier. This quality is vital to our future as a nation. If we ever closed the door to new Americans, our leadership in the world would soon be lost. A number of years ago, an American student traveling in Europe took an East German ship across the Baltic Sea. One of the ship's crew members from East Germany, a man in his 60s, struck up a conversation with the American student. After a while, the student asked the man how he had learned such good English, and the man explained that he had once lived in America. He said that for over a year he'd worked as a farmer in Oklahoma and California, that he'd planted tomatoes and picked ripe melons. It was, the man said, the happiest time of his life. Well, the student, who'd seen the awful conditions behind the Iron Curtain, blurted out the question, "Well, why did you ever leave?" "I had to," he said. The war ended. The man had been in America as a German prisoner of war. Now, I don't tell this story to make the case for former POWs. Instead, I tell this story just to remind you of the magical, intoxicating power of America. We may sometimes forget it, but others do not. Even a man from a country at war with the United States, while held here as a prisoner, could fall in love with us. Those who become American citizens love this country even more. And that's why the Statue of Liberty lifts her lamp to welcome them to the Golden Door. It is bold men and women yearning for freedom and opportunity who leave their homelands and come to a new country to start their lives over. They believe in the American dream, and over they make it come true for themselves, for their children, and for others. They give more than they receive, they labor and succeed, and often they are entrepreneurs. But their greatest contribution is more than economic, because they understand in a special way how glorious it is to be an American. They renew our pride and gratitude in the United States of America, the greatest, freest nation in the world, the last best hope of man on earth.
Thank you. So let's go to questions. Here's the way we are going to do it. You write down the questions. It's not going to be one-on-one. If you pose a question, you can mention a specific panelist to answer the question. We'll accumulate all the questions twice. They will answer, and we take another set, bearing time in mind. Professor Simon Mary. Professor Simon Mary, please, can you unmute him?
Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Professor Falola.
Where are you
Thank
calling
you for...
from? Where are you
I'm calling from Portland, Oregon, United States.
Okay.
I belong to the University of Portland, Oregon. I'm glad you showed us the clip that reminded me of the fact that the beauty of America that is being resisted today is the idea of inclusive democracy that was really a dream and has not yet matured, and it's being hijacked again by the return to imperialism. But I want to disagree to say that it's not isolationism that Trump is pushing forward, but it's a return to imperialism in a very radical manner. If you think it's isolationism, then you get it wrong. It's expanding. It's an expansionist. That said, I was surprised that the conversation on the BRICS nation, the alliance, BRIC alliance, and the Africa is not being mentioned. And we cannot really understand the United States if we just focus solely on the United States. We have to have a diverted third direction towards what is BRICS and Africa today, and how can Africa articulate or nurture that relationship? Maybe Professor Makhubela can answer that. I have two other questions quickly. I'm thinking about this as Professor Isike was talking, and also Professor LeVan. Africa's political philosophy, do we really have, do we all agree on the concept Africa? And I also had a problem with the idea of how Makhubela talked about that we are born into tribe. The idea of tribal identity today is a constructed identity during the colonial era. Maybe we might love reading this book by John Reader, a biography of the continent, Africa, where he articulates how that was produced as a way of controlling the continent. Then finally, we have entered a new age, a revolution, a new global revolution, the AI revolution. And I do think it is a gift to Africa, in the sense that Africa has the youngest population in the world, and that population is tech savvy. How are the nations in Africa galvanizing that generation to be able to nurture them, provide grants for the young generation to be able to foster their own talents that's there? And the final comment, 5 years ago, I was looking for a think tank center in Africa. I wanted to go and spend my sabbatical there to do research. And I was really shocked that South Africa had 10 think tanks. That was impressive. Nigeria had only 2. Nigeria, the first one, the only functioning one really was the one founded in 1956 or 58 that is being funded by the government. So the presidents who were asking, what are the academics doing? The academics, the United States is really, its foreign policies are shaped primarily by the think tanks and all that. So I think academics need to pressure, or the governments of Africa need to understand that the think tanks are the places where these new ideas can be developed and articulated that will benefit the continent. Otherwise, we'll just be dancing without a head on our bodies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olabode Birunke. Olabode Birunke, your comments, your questions. Yes, where are you calling from?
Yes, thank you so very much, Professor Toyin Falola, for moderating this very important conversation. And I thank all of the eminent participants and experts who have spoken to a very diverse number of issues. I teach at Rutgers University, but I'm currently at the University of Lagos. So I am calling from Lagos, Nigeria. I have a comment on the idea of democracy and a question on the issue of populism. So I think that those who are asking the question whether America, the United States of America, is still a democracy, understand full well that Donald Trump was elected by the majority of the people according to how democracy works. But the real kind of, the underlying kind of issue in that question is that the notion of democracy purports that it is the best form of government for a stable and prosperous society. And what the world really is seeing out of the United States of America is a very fragile and turbulent kind of politics and government. And so you really have to kind of ask that question, you know, as to the stability of that society and whether what we're seeing is just a passing phase or a new era. So that's a very important question to ask with regards to...
Thank you. Do you have another question? Oh, you've been muted. Sorry about that.
And the issue of populism, I think that it is accurate to describe a lot of what Trump has been doing in the past as populism, but I really wonder, and I think somebody kind of echoed that, you know, if you listen to him carefully, we're talking of think tanks, I think a lot of the ideas that he has been spouting come from something that is deeper than populism within the United States. You know, the idea of buying up Greenland has been on the wish list of many American governments for the last, 70 years or more. and many other ideas that he has been throwing out. So I think it's a tool for a kind of nationalism. And my worry is that the resurgence of nationalism in the United States can, in fact, inspire within Africa, with all of the fragile kind of coalitions of nationalities, similar kinds of proto-nationalisms, which can be very, very aggressive.
Thank you. From one head of state, where is our army and where is our nuclear power? So where is the army that you are asking us to do this, do that? Where is the nuclear power? Where is the army? Good question. Emeka Wadiora. Emeka and Wadiora. Oh, Emeka, yes, please. Go ahead, sir.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Where are you calling from?
My name is Emeka Wadiora. I'm a professor of law and psychology at Temple University in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
Thank you.
The question essentially has to do with the call for a united African passport, where I don't have to have a passport that is different from somebody from Zimbabwe or South Africa or something like that. What has the panel got to say about this, and how does that foster international cooperation within nations and economic progress?
Thank you. Wahab Ademola says, you answer the questions, Ayisah.
No, I just wanted to say that I think you should balance the questions between men and women. There are many women's hands up, and I can see many.
I will call them.
Okay,
don't worry.
Thank you.
You don't like national unity.
I don't. Not at the expense of women.
Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you, sir.
Take it. Yes. Go ahead.
Yeah. My question is just I'm bothered about absence of ideological groups that we used to have in the 60s, 70s, and 80s in our higher institutions, because we just operate as individuals now, and that without these groups, some of these issues that have been intelligently raised will be difficult to also be implemented in terms of getting the younger generations to also be abreast of some of these issues. So these groups are vanishing if they are not even existent again. And most times our unionists in the higher institutions are no more addressing pertinent issues in terms of debates and lectures and
Thank you. It came up. Your point came up when we were discussing the role of the left. So I'm sure the panelists will return to that. Jessica Odudu, please forgive me if I don't pronounce your name very well. I apologize. Jessica Odudu, yes, please.
That's fine. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. It's been an amazing conversation. I have two questions, one to all the panelists and another one specifically to the first panelist that spoke about the AGOA. I hope I got that right.
That's Carl LeVan.
Carl, yes. So my first question is, it seems like there are two massive elephants in the room of Africa. Externally, we are somewhat handicapped by our so-called comparative advantage, which makes us much more a consumerist nation on the global order of things. And internally, we have a deficit of leadership that will not be fixed anytime soon within these 4 years of Trump. So my real quick question to all the panelists is, if we could have a document, and if we had one thing we could put on the table to say, this is the one thing in 4 years, maybe a lower hanging fruit that we think as Africa should be pursued based off of all your expertise, should be on this table, that is not just, that is smart, attainable, it is something that we can see something tangibly of this 4 years of Trump. what would that be? So when you put it, it's not just the broad idea of what it is, but maybe a bit of a work through on how you think that can work, that can be pursued, that we can rally against, because these big issues are not going to be fixed anytime soon. So that's the first question. And my second question, I'm not the best economist. Personally, I still find it difficult to believe in global economy, but it is a thing. And one thing I'm realizing is that with the increase in tariffs, should Trump go ahead, is that a lot of the burden will be placed on the consumers more than it is the importers or the exporters, which could be very disastrous for Africa, based off of what I understand. Please correct me if I'm wrong, because that means there would be a possibility of transferred inflation, and we import more than we ever do export. So that could be a very big issue for us. So my question to Carl would be, is this an issue, or am I just thinking of things in the wrong way? And two, if it is there a way you believe we can kind of bring this as an issue if the AGOA should be on the table to be renegotiated again this year? So thank you. I look
Where are
forward
you
to
calling from? I can't. My technical people have. Where are you calling from?
I'm Nigerian. I'm Jessica from Nigeria.
Okay. Evelyn Ugbe or Ugbe? Evelyn. Why waiting for Evelyn? Can we take Bookie Williams?
Yeah.
Please. Go ahead, ma.
Good evening,
Good
everyone.
evening.
My name is Suba. I'm from Nigeria, but I live in Kampala, Uganda. And thank you.
You live in Kampala. You're from Uganda. Thank you.
I know, but I'm originally Nigerian. So thank you for this conversation, and I think it's very necessary. I would like to say though that I think even the
Can you raise your voice or your volume?
Yeah, we can't hear.
It's difficult to hear you. Can you raise your volume?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, is this better now?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right. So I wanted to ask a question, really, to jump straight to the point, which I think His Excellency talked about, but I would like all of the panelists to comment when talking about an agenda for Africa. One of the things that we've seen African countries talk about, specifically at the UN and at the regional level, is around the issues of illicit financial flows and the need for tax justice to be able to address the issue of debt, to be able to address the issue of development. And that's something that it seems like most African countries, we've seen the Africa Group willing to negotiate on that. We've seen some traction from G77. We've also saw the UN tax reform agenda that's moving forward. But we are seeing pushback from the West. We are seeing pushback instead of adopting that agenda. And also this year at the AU, the focus is on justice through reparations, right? And so that is something that distinct African countries are willing to talk about. And we know that according to UNCTAD, the African continent loses about $88 billion from illicit financial flows. And so my question is that an agenda that African countries can rally around? Is it something that could be considered a critical area that African countries can focus on and to be able to get the support they need from it? Is it something soft might be able to turn the other way and focus on something else? Because I really do think it's critical for us to focus on how are we going to fund public services if, as USA, they decide they don't want to do it anymore, which is our reality.
Thank you very much. Questions of debt and illicit wealth transfer. That's what I had us talking about. Ngozi Uzoma, University of Nigeria. Ngozi Uzoma, University of Nigeria, Nsukka.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Falola.
What makes me think Ngozi is a woman's name?
Okay. Yeah. It's the circumstances beside my birth. I was born when it was raining, so my grandfather named me Ngozi. That's a blessing.
Bless. That's good.
Yeah. So my positionality is
I'm a principal investigator here in University of Nigeria, Nsukka, on an EU project on return migration. So we have seen in the one of Trump's executive order is on mass deportation of immigrants. You call it irregular immigrants here, of immigrants. My question goes especially to Carl, but any other person can still answer. Why should African countries accept those that are deported? Because the African countries don't have the resources to reintegrate them. And due to the post-colonial context in which we have in Africa, it's difficult to reintegrate some of these returnees, because I interviewed the returnees. Even it doesn't matter any amount you give to them, it's difficult for them to stay. They always have the tendency to remigrate, move again towards probably towards North Africa or
Thank you. There are bilateral agreement on deportation, repatriation. The way it works is they first put you in a deportation center, check your passport, negotiate with your country. Some countries refuse. There were occasions when the Chinese will refuse. And some citizens will change their country. They will say they're from Ghana instead of they're saying they're from Nigeria. So there are so many complications. And mind you, deportation centers, some of them are private because you can create your private prison in the US and charge per day. So this is also an avenue for some businessmen to make money because they are being paid. Bayo Molola. Thank you, Ngozi. Bayo Molola. Yes, sir. Please unmute him. Please unmute him. We've designed all sorts of arrangements to prevent Zoom bombers so that they don't disturb us, so we know how to catch them. That's why we're following all this mute, unmute, not showing video, so that they won't harass us. Please go ahead. Please unmute him. Let him talk. Unmute yourself, sir. We're having technical difficulty. While we resolve that, Dorothy Davis, yes, please. Can you unmute her, please?
Hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. Yes.
Okay. I'm Dorothy Davis. I'm in Washington, D.C. I am very thankful for this conversation on many levels. Some of the points I want to make, I don't want to be interpreted as racist. It's coming from a different angle. So the first one is the issue of lobbying, African countries lobbying in the US. This is very important. However, the issue here is African countries pay a lot of money to white lobbyists in the US. And those lobbyists don't have any real interest in Africa or that country or whatever. And so the frustration in the US is that African Americans who know Africa, understand Africa, care about Africa, when we go to African ambassadors or countries, we are dismissed as though we are not familiar with the issues or have the power to get done what needs to be done. I've seen this for decades. Okay, that's number one. Number two, yes, what you are seeing in terms of the majority of Americans voting for Trump is America. To me, it represents what America has always been. So it's not a real surprise. It seems to be a surprise to the rest of the world, but it really is not a surprise. But I will say that Trump narrowly got the majority vote. I question a bit about the democracy piece. Okay, so if you look at democracy as purely the person who got the most votes or got the most electoral college votes won the game, so to speak. Yes, that's a democracy. But if you look at the assumption that all have the opportunity to vote, that is not a democracy. Okay, so you have to take into account suppression of vote. You have to take into account intentional fear tactics so that poll workers won't want to monitor the polls, or people won't vote for fear of being killed or maimed or harassed or whatever, which is what is happening in the US. The other thing is, and I'm sure Kingsley would remember this, in South Africa under apartheid, you had to carry passes. We now, who are non-white, have to carry our passports wherever we go, grocery shopping, wherever, because we don't know if ICE is going to come and get us in the shop, in a school, in a bus stop. We don't know, but we do
in a church.
Church, wherever. So we have to carry our passports, okay? And I'm talking about U.S. citizens. And if you want to go to citizens with the birthright of being U.S. citizens, whatever term they want to use, we still have to carry these passports because they can't distinguish our color. And that's the real issue, okay? So I would question the assumption that there is a democracy in the US. Okay, and the third piece is, and this is where I really don't want you to see me as a racist, but every time, many times, I watch or involved in conversations like this, the person representing the US is always white. Always. Now, I'm not saying, Professor LeVan, that you are not qualified or anything. You are fine. I appreciate all you're saying. All I'm saying is, can we add another dimension every time the conversation comes up? Because there are experts who can speak about it, who are of African American descent or diasporan descent in the US. So I just want to put that out there. That's it.
Thank you, Dorothy. Carl, because I invited him, he's invited not because of his African knowledge. Not that there are no African people, but you've raised, let me expand on your points because they are very significant. So I do not know who the speechwriter for Trump would be with respect to Africa. But during Obama, some of us were very upset with his speeches, especially the one he gave in Ghana. I cannot tell you because of confidentiality issues, in which the State Department contacted me. I thought they would use the speech. They didn't use the speech. And the speech writers, I know them, they're my friends, became dominantly African Americans. So on the African side, there's also a reverse of what you are talking about. And because I fully understand what you're saying. I live within walking distance of 14th Street in DC. I was a professor of the South, Library of Congress. And when you get to 14th Street, you're not going to find you're not going to find an African lobbyist or find African American lobbyists. There are a few. Or because I just love going to the place, I love going to the White House. It's just within walking distance of my house. And I once met a delegation from Mali, and I said, why are you wasting your money? So we have issues, and one of the head of state just sent me a question asking the audience, you're asking us to do this, you're asking us to do that. Where is the power to do that? and power equilibrium, power calculations, they go into. I don't want to answer the question. I'm not a panelist, unfortunately. I'm just a moderator. I'm eager to listen to them. Professor Badejo, you work for the United Nations. What do you want to say? Professor Badejo, former staff of the United Nations. Sir, where are you? While waiting for Professor Badejo, technical people, can you locate him? Yes, sir.
And will we respond to any of these comments or move towards our closing comments?
No, you will respond. You will respond. Yes, Professor.
Yes, it's not much I want to say. I just want to note that America First of President Trump, I think it's very, very welcomed. Because that's what nations are supposed to do. But then we pretend that there are all these dialogue at the United Nations, at the World Bank, and when we don't see the reality of the fact that everybody is there for its interests, we are pretending to be dealing with global interests. So if somebody comes forward and say, America first, then you have to be thinking Nigeria first, South Africa first. What can we get out of the system? To continue to reign against President Trump, he's a sincere person. Sincere because the British, all of them, are doing exactly the question of their countries first. And we should address that. More importantly for me is that Dr. Kingsley and Dr. Ayisah were talking about democracy. And Carl LeVan also. We see voting as democracy. Even the lady that just spoke before me was emphasizing a different portion with respect to that same voting. Democracy is by far greater than the question of voting. And the earlier we start articulating and realizing this, the better for this continent, because like we were sold religion, and the land was taken away from us, we are being sold a different ideology, and that ideology of democracy. Have you heard voting? What is the party system like? Mobutu was told that he must do that, and he called all his relations and in-laws and what they want parties. The next time they come, we will be having 37 parties. What is the status of the people in his country? But it is when Carl LeVan is saying what he's saying, he is contrasting with China. He's not concerned about China pulling people out of poverty, which should be the maximum end of democracy. Because if you look at it, they say government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Now, voting is just a small infinitesimal part of that. But we over-focus on voting.
Let me ask you a question. So
yes,
Kemi is talking like Trump now. A recent statement is to say UK is not a hotel. UK is not a hotel. And they are doing a match next week in one town in Britain. So
yes,
how do you, sir, with your experience working in different parts of the world, this very moment, why is it that immigration is driving it? I'm asking you, why is this moment being driven by immigration? And why is your fellow citizen, the head of the Conservative Party, is saying, look, I'm not representing your people. I am a British citizen.
I know you want to provoke me, but I'm going to avoid that. Kemi is a black Brit, and representing his party. But you have rightly noted, there is a problem of how much can be extracted from the world to make things comfortable in just one side of the globe. And you are having a situation in which people from who things are being extracted are refusing to stay where they are being extracted from. And they are wanting to push into, we have a right. You came to our continent. You took all what you took. We have a right to be back. Of course, the Americans will say we didn't take, but they know very well, if you go away from that facade of democracy, you will see the role of the IMF, World Bank, more clearly and be able to understand the fact that it doesn't have to be. So with the dwindling of capacities in the world, people are moving, and those they are moving to are rejecting them, that they are not welcomed. And
thank you
that's
very
the
much.
problem we are facing.
Thank you. We will be bringing in April the president of the African Development Bank, additional, who has agreed to participate, and we'll ask him some of these questions. Now, panelists have taken a rest. If you are interested in asking questions, please don't go away. They are fully rested. I've allowed them to rest for 30 minutes. So please answer any question of your choice. Don't attempt to answer all the questions, because we are going to have a final round and you are going to make closing statements. Please answer any question. Yes, Carl, answer any question of your interest. Please go ahead.
So I'm gonna wrap my closing comments together with responses to some of those questions.
We're not closing yet. We're just answering that set of questions.
I think I'm going to include my closing comments as part of my responses, if that's okay.
Okay.
So I'm really grateful that you started with that video by Ronald Reagan, who talked about immigrants as new Americans and who referred to America as a shining beacon on a hill for Americans. That version of the Republican Party is dead. And that's so interesting to me, because becoming involved in politics as a young person in the 1980s and 1990s, Ronald Reagan was like a saint to Republicans who were often, on a different side of the bargaining table from me. And so, it's a really important place to begin. And I think it really tells us, how far America has drifted in some ways in the last couple of decades. Going back a little bit, the question about national unity, I want to agree with Ayishah's response that I'm not sure that my writings or her writings or Professor Isike's writings say that. One interesting scholar whose work has been advancing my own thinking about how national unity fits in with these economic questions is Elliot Green, who has a new book out, who talks about how the type of economy impacts around the world the level of assimilation of domestic diversity, not of immigrants, of domestic diversity. And he draws upon Africa and New Zealand and the United States and Europe, and it's really quite a fascinating argument. And urbanization is a really important part of that too. What I'm getting at is that there is a political economy of national unity, that after independence, a significant part of the project in Africa was a social project and a political project. And I think today, a big piece of that is a political economy project. And, when I'm, reflecting upon the comments earlier about, from the African leaders who are present, I think Chris and Ayisah and I and you, Prof. Falola, I think we're striving to speak a language of social science, not a language of tribalism. So I hope that really comes through today. The question on democracy, prompted by the gentleman from Unilog, hope to see you in Lagos in June, and I think it's been raised by others. Democracy is definitely more than voting. There's no question about that. That's how it's measured by political scientists. That's how it's practiced by ordinary citizens. And I think that's why I highlighted the problems with rule of law in the United States at the outset of this discussion. I think some of the things that are new about the new era of democracy is that the expectations for participation, not just in the United States, but around the world, have really changed. There's been a massive growth in the use of referendums, for example, since the 1970s around the world. Some of my own research has documented this. And then with the information age, people want to participate and influence politics in very different ways. And this is where I think, the comment about populism is also important, is that Trump's electoral victory in 2016 was driven in a large part by small financial donations. Small financial donations from ordinary Americans were very important. There was a financial piece to his populism. This time around, it was a very different campaign, and that's what you saw at the inauguration stage with the billionaires behind him and all those pictures from the inaugural balls. So I think, it's going to be a challenge for Trump and his administration to sustain that paradox and that constantly contradictory imagery. To address Dorothy Davis's, thoughts, I think there's been a tremendous shift in the last 30 years about who's on a panel. And I'm not here on a panel representing the United States. I'm here on a panel talking about social science. And I happen to have, some deep expertise on the United States government. And I'm pleased to be affiliated with the African Center for the Study of the United States at the University of Pretoria. And Professor Isike and I have some wonderful conversations about things that we disagree with and we learn from each other. And I think that's what's happening in the panel today. On the point about lobbying, I don't think the point is about the racial identity of the lobbyists. I think the bigger concern, and this is a message for the African governments who are listening, is don't hire lobbyists at all. Don't outsource your foreign policy. I think, it's time to have a much more robust cultural exchange program, to have political officers who work in your embassies, to have universities that train foreign service officers and who are civil servants, regardless of who the president is. And, the aspirational model I would point to, and this is going to surprise you, is Taiwan. Why does the United States have close relations with Taiwan? Why does the United States have close relations with Taiwan despite China just being right there? It's because Taiwan had a robust diplomatic soft power outreach over many decades, and it worked. And you see that in the congressional votes, and you see that in the rhetoric on Taiwan from politicians from both sides of the party. So there's a couple other things I'd like to talk about, but definitely want to share that. And the other, quick comment I think to Dorothy Davis is, just to sort of invert your comment about race a little bit. In 1999, when I was working on Capitol Hill, Congresswoman Cynthia McKinney, an African American from Georgia, I was in a meeting with her, and she got really upset. And she said, "How come nobody asked me about Yugoslavia just because I'm Black? Everyone assumes that I should only be talking about Africa." And I've always taken that with me as a really powerful lesson about how we can value expertise just for being expertise.
Well, sometimes they also do the opposite, in which they think you know everything. That's how I was treated in Washington. They thought I knew about Jamaica. From Jamaica, I knew about Black Germany. I just knew everything. And sometimes at very short notice. Fortunately, I had staff that can give me my own brief to brief some other people. But this assumption that as a scholar, you know everything. Kingsley, Your Excellency, please, can you answer the question? Without the bombs and without nuclear and without the army, why are we telling them these days do that? You worked with 2 presidents before.
No, 3, 4 of them.
3 presidents. And one of the presidents is asking this question: why are you giving them advice when you know they don't have power?
Let me really start by acknowledging what Dorothy said, and I must confess, Dorothy is a good friend of mine. But I just want to lift up and really nuance this question of lobby. She worked for quite some time for the the African American Institute, that really played critical lobby for us when we were lobbying against different legislation, anti-apartheid legislation in different counties. I think from the early 90s or late 80s. So I found that the use of the lobby in certain instances is very useful, and Washington operates on basis of lobby. That's why Trump will start by criticizing them and saying you're taking money from lobbyists and so on. So the question of, I don't know, why do we need armies and nuclear weapons? We certainly don't need that in the continent. We need to spend our resources in building capacity, in institutional capacity to deliver on the basic needs. You would find in most cases our armies are well-resourced, and yet the ordinary people are so poor. If they are not well-resourced, actually, they're likely to remove the politician in power. It's a big problem. It's a vicious cycle. I don't know why do we spend so much in that. The last thing that, Prof, I want to comment on, I think it was directed to me, specifically the BRICS issue. The BRICS issue, it's still an issue that I think Professor Simon would agree. All of us are still trying to study the BRICS, what kind of models they have, the decision-making, how important they are. But one thing for sure is that within this discussion of multipolarity, they become one center of power. And now we need to understand how they exercise this power. Is this power exercised on the basis of that you do certain things for us to allow you to have access to the BRICS? It's still a very amorphous organization to try to understand. It works on consensus. There's no secretariat that does anything. The only host country prepares the agenda and so on. It's something that we're still trying to understand, but it's a crucially important in the mix of the multipolarity. The identity issue, Prof, I think there's a lot of study, and as a political scientist, I would subscribe to that study, that really defines the question of identity as an identity. And that identity has nothing to do with colonial rule. It's being used by colonial rule. That's why in the study or in the literature on identity, it sees identity as an instrument. And it becomes very useful when there's poor access to resources, when there's political campaigning. That's when identity becomes so nuanced. And you can break that identity down to small family units. I mean, I did a detailed study on the Somalis. And if you understand the clan, the sub-clans, and so on, really breaking down to matrial and patrial lines, that's how it operates. That's the identity. It only becomes used by politicians. I mean, when the colonizers came to South Africa, they found the Zulus and Xhosas, and those were tribes that were there. And they live harmoniously amongst each other, and you can't take that away. It's a primordial identity that exists. And I think there's a lot of research that speaks to that. Thank you.
So let me follow up on that important question on lobbying, and I will ask Chris to answer it. So when Wangari Maathai was alive, I was part of the team that was fundraising for her. And part of the thing we discovered very quickly is that not a single scholar in the diaspora can be of any help, not even a single one. And whether it's in South Africa or US, the assumption that you find on social media, I've written this book, I've written this essay, doesn't connect to anything. I told the Nobel laureate, I said, all the African scholars in the US, they're not up to one finger of Oprah Winfrey. That all of us collectively in the diaspora, we don't have the influence of a single lobbyist on the 14th Street. So the exaggeration of these African scholars, African scholarship in relation to politics is overrated. When xenophobia broke out in South Africa, I was one of the people on the team that AU sent to go and talk to our people. And you quickly realize the disconnect between scholarship and influence. That on the one hand, we're able to write great pieces, but we are not able to accumulate all this knowledge into any significant impact. So we can produce a mayor in Houston. We have 50,000 Nigerians there. We can influence politics in DC. We have so many Africans in Baltimore and DC. Why is that? And how can we begin to think differently in terms of how we align scholarship with policies? It's a difficult question, yes?
It's quite difficult. Let me give an example. In this country, when we grew up, I grew up in Soweto, the street where we used to live, there were people from around the continent. And the question of where they come from has never been an issue as we were growing up. So it's being used now. I mean, if you look at the attacks against foreigners in this country, it's being used, and the excuse is that they are taking our jobs, they are taking our resources, they're taking our informal trading. So it's being used by politicians, and politicians are really behind some of these issues. Part of the big debate in this country is whether do we have xenophobic tendencies or not. Some people say it's Afrophobic tendencies, because this is directed mainly at Africans. There's a large number of Asians and Europeans, particularly East Europeans, who have settled here, and you don't see a similar approach to them because the contestation for resources is in a total different terrain. Now, if you come here, you're going to contest for resources with me as a Black person in my terrain, and that's why the resentment, and that's why people would use that. You know, the disconnect between the scholarship and reality sometimes. That's why scholarship is not stagnant. It kept on being refined, and new ideas that are emerging are added on it, and changing the patterns that we see in the consumption that are there. Because what was written a few years ago may not be relevant now because of certain dynamics on the ground. So the scholarship requires to be updated now and then.
No, it's more advertisement. Sunday next week, we are doing writing biographies. Writing biographies. We invite you to join a team of panelists who have written biographies. And we are bringing Dele Faro Timi to talk about law and the Nigerian nation in view of its current crisis. What does law have to do with this? And we are bringing Dabiri to talk about diaspora, and we are bringing additional to talk about African economics. And we are talking about Afropolitanism. Some of us are very happy that Nina got a contract for a book, $1 million US. That's our recent good news, that we now have an African scholar who was able to get a book advance contract for $1 million US. We'll be talking about Afrofuturism. Ayisha, please.
Thank you. I mean, it's been a really rich conversation, and I just wanted to add to this conversation about the diaspora, and I think there's a link for me with ethnicity, and I'd like to start with just saying a very quick anecdote. When I lived in Berlin for a year between 2019 and 2020, I noticed that the most well-stocked African shop belonged to a Bangladeshi person. And I took a few trips to the African-owned African stores, and their shelves were largely empty. And when I asked why this was the case, the answer that I got was very simple, and is one that actually is the reality of how we live in many of our countries. And the response was that while the Bangladeshis will come together and put their money, pool their resources so they can buy in bulk and stock properly, we Africans remain very suspicious of each other for different ethnic issues and religious issues. And that's why so for me, the conversation about the influence of Africans in the diaspora, or Nigerians in Houston or Baltimore, even if they're academics, unfortunately, as Dr. Kingsley said, while I didn't agree with him that we're born into ethnicity, but we are socialized into it, and we hold on to those identities as one of the most important things, rightly or wrongly. And I think that also speaks to the question that one of the presidents asked earlier about ethnicity. The truth is, ethnicity has been used as a weapon first by the colonialists, then by those who inherited the extractive state from them, and it continues to be used constantly. So we come, even when we move to the diaspora, with these prejudices about the Igbos and the Yorubas and the Hausas or the Tutsis and everything, and we still can't collaborate. But I think that's not the conversation that we're here for today. We're here to talk about Africa, but maybe that's part of the problem as well. I would like to respond just very briefly to the question about R&D. Well, it wasn't really about R&D, but the question about where's the army, where's the nuclear power made me think, how much do we spend on R&D? How much do we spend on R&D? And who dictates? Who here dictates where the budget goes? We spend less than 1%. The average for all of Africa is 0.4% of our GDP on R&D. Egypt is the highest spender with 1%, followed by Rwanda at 0.6% and Tunisia at 0.7%. So the president that asked that question, please, Prof, ask him how much in his own country, how much does he dedicate in the budget for research and development if he wants to be a nuclear power? So, and I think that question is also related in a way to the observation about the lack of think tanks. Think tanks need to be resourced. We don't value education, unfortunately, in the continent. Not the people value it, but starting with the structural adjustment programs that were initiated in 1986, I think, that generally ruined the economies within our universities. That's when we started seeing the beginning of serious brain drains. So who is going to run these think tanks? And then when you layer on the lack of investment in education on top of ethnicity, so that who gets to be a vice chancellor, who gets to be head of department is all determined by their ethnicity, maybe their religion, as opposed to whether they're actually doing any work, whether they deserve those positions. Everything has become politicized. So for the person who asked that question about the lack of think tanks, the truth is think tanks need to be resourced, and we're a largely impoverished society. Most of the people who have money are the politicians, and they won't fund the think tanks. And even when they do, then they definitely, as every person who pays the piper dictates the tune. Then when they fund the think tanks are there to only do their bidding. So I'll stop there. But one more comment, though, on the question of America's democracy. I wanted to say, with apologies to Professor Badejo and to Dorothy Davis, yes, I personally was being facetious when I mentioned that, almost 80 million people voted for Donald Trump, and that's what they wanted. I agree, voting and elections do not equal democracy. Democracy is much deeper than that. It includes the rule of law. It includes respect for rights. It includes respect for free speech and all that, all of which is always in contention in every country, including in the United States. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Chris, do you want to pass or you want to say something?
I've got a few things to say.
Okay.
So first, when I talked about isolationism, it was in terms of engagements, multilateral engagements. You can be isolationist and still be imperialist, and we've seen this with China. We've seen this in the US in the 1930s when the isolationist policy of the US was put in place. The US engaged with Latin America, even though they were not engaged with most of the world, Europe, and engaging in conflicts in Asia broadly. So there are different layers of isolationism. That's the point I wanted to make about that. Then to the question about privileging unity, I think it's important to reiterate this, even though Ayisah has done some justice to it. It is a statist notion, of security that prioritizes the political state, and focuses on regime security. That borders about the abstract terms like unity. These things are abstract because at the end of the day, the whole essence of a political community called state, the state is an imagined political community of what? Of people. The state is about people. So there is no way we can talk about the state without looking at the people that make up the state, all right? And the whole purpose of the state exists for them. Okay, and even scholars like Asimoglu and Robinson that wrote the question of why nations fail have started agreeing that the people component of that equation of industrialization and all the economic recommendations they make, they've started agreeing that people are important. So if development is about people, if the state exists for people, then there's no way we're not going to talk about ageism, young people, the component of young people, the ratio, and women, and all these other components that make up the human population of a state. And then we'll begin to pay attention to actually developing these people. A good question of how much do we put into research and development? Maybe a broader question would be, how much is our budget on education? Many of the countries in Africa do not meet the United Nations, the UNESCO requirement for how much you should put on education. And there are countries like the Nordic countries, like even, let's talk about Switzerland, that doesn't have a natural resource, that has one of the most advanced economies based on development of people. The Nordic countries have the highest rate of human development in the world. Okay, ahead of the United States, ahead of the biggest economies, ahead of the biggest militaries. They have 99% education, for example. Those are the things that we should be talking about, for states in Africa. I'd like to answer the question of lower hanging fruit, because nobody has talked about that. The lady asked about lower hanging fruit, and the one lower hanging fruit I would reiterate is intra-Africa trade. We already have the AFTA, so it doesn't have to do anything. We don't have to do anything bigger. We just need to start trading with ourselves. I assure you, if our leaders put the political will to trading within ourselves alone, we will not need AGOA, we will not need development aid from even the United States or anyone else. Another lower hanging fruit, which Ayisah kind of talked about, would be for funding of research think tanks. I am director of the African Center for the United States. I've written several letters to heads of state to tell them, we have this center that can do research for you about America, tell you what you need to know about America, and we'll put them into policy briefs and give them to you free of charge. Just give us a bit of money to do this research and to run the centers. No response till date. Even our state government here in South Africa is not responding. So, like someone said, in fact, not half, the United States Department of State and the Department of Education fund African Studies centers in the US. There are over 40 of them. They get grants annually from either the State Department or Department of Education. And you know where those US Africa policies come from? They come from these same Africa Studies centers. They give them information that they put together into policies. We can do the same. And I assure you, what we need in this regard is to simply crank out an Africa-US policy. This can be done within a year if our leaders will put money into think tanks.
Thank you, Chris. Kingsley has to tell you that your letter has not been read by any head of state. Getting a head of state to read a letter is as difficult as the needle passing through the eyes of the
It wasn't to the heads of state, it was to their department, it was to the director in the presidency who should read those.
The letter won't get there. That you still you need a lobbyist for a letter to get to the desk of any president in the world. Even if to talk about any important thing, even you're from Nigeria, I mean, for Ayisah Osori to read a letter, you have to go through a layer of bureaucracy. So let's take 3 more questions to respect those who have been waiting for so long. For now, Evelyn Ugbe, I call you before. Are you around, Evelyn? Before Ayisah protest on your behalf.
Unmute her mic, she said she couldn't unmute Steve before.
Unmute. Evelyn, are you here? While waiting for Evelyn, I'm calling you as is listed for me. Ekundayo, Ulugbemiga Ekundayo. Yes, please. Please go ahead. And be brief. My panelists are tired.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Yes, I can imagine they've done a good job. Okay, sorry, I'm on board now. I've been struggling to unmute. So my name is Evelyn. I represent Center for Redefining Civic Engagement for Africa. It's a non-profit organization. So thank you very much, Professor Falola, for this session, and thank you, distinguished panelists. But Mr. Christopher had already, touched on the question I want to raise, but then I, still want to ask is about the after. What, in terms of recommendations and engagement in the Trump administration, how can African leaders capitalize on the African free continental trade area to, engage in the Trump administration? And I know at this point, we'll be really discussing towards the way forward. As experts in the field, as panelists, what would you advise our African leaders to prioritize as an African agenda? What would be the top priorities in the Trump administration? Thank you for the opportunity. Look forward to the responses.
Listening to you, I'm surprised they have not left. I'm very grateful to the excellencies. And what follows is 2 minutes after this session is over, the entire transcript is released to the world. We do not edit it. We don't tamper with it. 2 minutes after it's all over, the transcript is released. And I do my own analysis of what you've been saying and publish it in newspapers. And there are so many media here, I don't know what they're going to say. They say whatever attracts their attention. And I also thank all the media. I'm always eager after this session to see how it will be reported. I can tell you that people have joined from 37 countries, although they're asking us not to specify the details. Sikiru Yusuf, you are next. And after you, Christopher. Sikiru Yusuf, yes, please. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much. I'm speaking from Florida, Miami to be precise. And of course, what's my question all about has almost been answered. But the privilege that I have is the fact that we have some of our president also joining this session. And my question is focusing on the pauperization of our universities in Africa and how it has affected the whole idea of think tank, right? Because if we talk about think tank, I'm privileged to be a grad student here at Florida International University, and I'm a presidential fellow, which, of course, under which I'm enjoying my PhD studies here in United States. Do we have some of these opportunities back in Africa that allows us to stay on the continent, given the fact that if we have this opportunity, we could be able to undertake our studies on the continent, study what are the challenges on the continent, and of course, provide solutions to some of these challenges. Because what I've come to realize is the fact that here in the United States, my conversation with some of my colleagues, particularly those in sciences, is the fact that many of their courses they take, many of their research is domiciled in the United States. And a number of them are not thinking about going back home because the knowledges they are acquiring is specifically meant to address some of the challenges facing the United States, not Nigeria or Africa. And if we continue to go this route, how do we address some of the critical issues of development that is facing us in Africa? So that's why I think it has been addressed, but the opportunity to speak to some of our president listening to us, that we need to reinvest and we have to be intentional about developing our university system if truly we want to develop a think tank that could help us address some of the challenges. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. Christopher, please go ahead. You have electricity challenge where you are calling from.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Oh, no, I'm actually on my outside. I just had to join in, and I've been enjoying this platform so much. I'm a former student of Professor Christopher Isike, and also I've been able to meet Dr. Makhubela Kingsley during one of my defense with Professor Maxi Schoolman at University of Pretoria. I'm in the UK, and I just want to ask a question on some of the issues that has been raised there. And I think I want to talk to everyone and also my professor, Professor Christopher, on the issue of America. And so I also love the video because my question is related to the video you played. Can we say, because that's where my question is from, can we say the American dream has been, shall I say, is a detriment? Can we say the American dream in itself is a detriment to Africa? Whose benefit in itself?
By that, because, what do you mean, the American dream? What
because
do you mean?
From the video we watched, there's this statement that America has been able to be stronger and has brought people from all over the world, whereby people believe when they go to America, they make it. Why is it not so for other nations of the world? That's what I'm saying. Who benefits from the American dream? That's where I'm trying to frame who benefits from that American dream. Because now what we are seeing is that one of the reasons why I believe Trump has come back to government is simply because people in the Western world, just like here in the UK, there's this anti-immigration sentiment that is growing. And in as much as we don't want to fault people, because there's this narrative that goes on that once you are against immigration, you are being labeled far right. I'm a centrist, if I'm to define myself, but once you are against immigration, there's this sentiment you are far right, and we can see that same wave in Europe, in Germany, in Romania, in different parts of Europe. So that's where I'm trying to look at it, that whose benefit is the American dream? And has it been detrimental to other nations, even Africa? We can also take it from the issue of Afrophobia or xenophobia in South Africa. Because when we look at the way people in South Africa voted in the last election, we'll see that the ANC lost its majority, and even in coalition with a party, or should I say parties, which people thought were the party of the oppressors, if I can use that statement. And to me, on the issue of immigration, because I think someone raised that question, from what I've seen in the UK here and why some who are being labeled as anti-immigration or far right is simply because I think there's truly a problem of integration. I was going to work one day and I also look at the opinion of people around me, and what actually happened was that there was a big billboard on the highway. It was there for about a month. And everything, I'm just using this as an example, everything on the platform was written in Arabic. It was written in, and people were complaining because even me, I wanted to know what is written there. It was there for a month, but the state billboard was on a major highway, Arabic. Then as a political student, I was also trying to weigh people's opinion, and that is just one. And we are talking about some communities whereby you can go and you can simply see that it's like there's a cultural erosion. When I look at the issue of America also, we started seeing some videos that doesn't represent what we had or the idea of America we used to know. People on the street sleeping, homelessness was high. People on illicit drugs. We can see all these things were on the internet, which was projecting America in a bad image, and I think that will also led to that era of people seeing America like that. So that's why I actually coming to ask on this question. Maybe
Thank you. And I want to bring you finally Olugbemiga Kundayo so that you don't feel slighted. Olugbemiga Kundayo, please go ahead. You are the final, the last person.
Thank you very much. My own is going to be very short.
Thank you.
A lot of what I've heard around the table and on this show, I think eventually people came back to the issue of identity and all these things about phobia and all that. But I think there's another key issue that needs to be addressed that started in 1884, 85 in Germany, in Berlin. I think that part of the reason why we have these issues is a structural one. We have towers of Babel in the place we call Africa. Not that we weren't having wars or we weren't collaborating before, we were. But everywhere where the language, where people don't understand one another, is no vision can shine through and no sight can see anything. So what are the low-hanging fruits? I also heard that. In the past 60 years that most African countries have been, they've not gone back to look at their educational curricula and seen how that changes the way people see themselves and things. The second one is that since we've all been in power, quote unquote, we've been following all these constitutions and all these setups that have been created by colonialists to fit their own needs. None of them looked at our own needs. And so I know that is not the center of this discussion, but I think it's something to put on the table so that every time we think about AGOA or we think about African Trade Union and all those types of things, we have to think about this fundamental structural issue of Berlin 1884-85. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, closing statements from our distinguished panelists. They're tired. I have to thank them for enduring this 3 hours long conversation. Closing statements. Chris, make your closing statement.
Okay, so we don't have to answer the question.
You can answer the question, but wrap it up with your closing statement.
Closing statement. Okay, thanks. All right, so it's the two that I would want to. So the last one, I agree with you. The problem is structural, so we need to visit the question of the state system, because the structure, the political structure, is the states, and everything else, happens within that framework. Once we get that foundation wrong, everything else we build on top of it is shaky. So that's the one. On AFTA, I think that my answer is that Trump respects people who create value. Okay, so what is the low-hanging fruit for AFTA? We should simply trade with ourselves as Africans. It's already there, like I said before. Let's make it happen. And once the value starts, developing, because with some of that trade will come needed industrialization. Maybe that will take a longer time. But if we start trading within ourselves, there will be value that will create a market that Trump himself will be interested in, and then we can have a discussion. The last point I wanted to talk about was when someone talked about lobbyists, paying lobbyists. My question to myself was, why do African leaders need to even pay lobbyists when we have the African diaspora? I know that Professor Falola said the science diaspora in the US, for example, is exaggerated. But when I look at the diaspora, I don't just look at academics or the scientists. I'm looking at the diaspora as a whole, a community of people, just like you have the Jewish community, the Chinese diaspora, the Irish diaspora in the United States. In 2022, I think, I was in the US for 3 months, and Professor Falola is one of those Nigerian Americans I interviewed. I interviewed 52 Nigerian Americans, just talking to them and asking them questions around the soft power value that they have for Nigeria and the US because of their dual citizens. And one of the things I found out from that study was that the cleavages, the social cultural cleavages, the religious and ethnic cleavages that define the national question and nationhood in Nigeria is exported abroad. so that you have these groups that can't come together on anything political, but can come for social cultural activities, but not for political activities. And that's a problem. Last year with one of my colleagues, we came out with an article that looked at the religious and regional and religious, regional I think religious and regional drivers, ethnic and religious and regional drivers of Nigeria's foreign policy. And the same thing, you know, comes through. I can write the article for you to go read up on it. But the point is that the African diaspora, if it can come together, if it can unite around specific goals, it can develop into a voting bloc that can begin to make it influence policy of the US towards Africa and vice versa. But the governments have to be interested in them, have to even know them. Many of our governments do not even know their diaspora, even though the African Union has declared the African diaspora as the sixth region of Africa. So those are my answers to the question. So my concluding comments now, because we're talking about analyzing Trump, I would like to end on that, even though my whole thought has been about making Africa a collective agent. So what makes America great, like I said before, is its internationalism, its globalism, not necessarily its isolationist policies, which Trump's America First seems to imply. America's greatest arsenal that gave it world leadership status is not its hard power or military power, which relies on force or the threat of it. It is rather its soft power, which came from the political and economic values that it projected. American leaders and scholars, including people like, I forget his name now, have argued that their power comes with the responsibility to be the indispensable defender of a world made more stable and benign by democracy, settled borders, and universal values such as human rights. So Mr. Trump fundamentally misunderstands this canon, and by turning away from the values that made post-war America, he will be surrendering the single greatest threat that his despotic opponents in China or Russia do not possess. And this is something that needs to be talked about by even Americans themselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ayisah Osori.
Thank you. Thank you, Christopher. Thank you, everyone who's still here with us 3 hours in. I'm not going to attempt to answer any of the questions because I think my fellow panelists have done a great job. Forgive me. But in closing, I'll just say that I found the conversation where we said that, you know, the US is bipartisan on China in terms of Biden following Trump's policies. And the same way they're bipartisan about Africa. And so for me, that's at least one indication that we cannot treat Trump too specially or too differently from other presidents. I think we need to look inwards. Does that mean he doesn't seem to have a more disruptive agenda for the world order? Yes, it does seem so. But then this is a time for us to all just look inwards and see the globalization, neoliberalism hasn't seemed to work for the majority of the world. And this is an opportunity now, maybe with Trump, with everything that's happening, to sort of break the mold and be creative. But it requires the investment in time and resources that my co-panelists have talked about. We need to sort of sit together more. We need to spend more time. We need to look inwards, not in an isolationist way, but in a way that speaks to the future, to take what moral authority and soft power we have in Africa and wield it. But we can only do that from a position of strength if we come together. So whether we come together through the AU or through regional blocks, we still need to sort of sit together, decide. I really liked Christopher's intervention and recommendations for creating Africa. I think, what did he call them? Common positions, common African positions. This is where we need to go. We need to spend more time on that. We need to spend more time on implementing the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. And as we discuss and plan for the next 4 years, I would say let us not limit ourselves only to looking at the US. Let us do the hard work of asking the hard questions. The US also has its own limits, many of the things we heard about today, and those limits are not limited just to the president or who happens to be president at that time. One, the Americans who self-select to work on African policy tend to be motivated by paternalistic concerns, aid, humanitarianism, democracy promotion, international development, and a whole lot of other types of things that are not very useful in these days when all these things are being contested. And second, the US foreign policy establishment largely considers Africa to be a strategic backwater. That's the truth. And that's why, whether it's Republicans or whether it's Democrats, the policies seem to not change that very much. Let's focus on stretching the African Union, stretching our regional blocks, and build out the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. I think for me, those are the key takeaways. Thank you.
Your Excellency, your closing statement.
Well, let me start by thanking you, Professor Falola, and thank my fellow panelists. Most importantly, let me also thank, I know there are many people who have joined this platform, who've been listening to us, and for the questions they have raised. Really grateful for that. I think there are a few issues that I would like to take away from this discussion. One of these issues that I think we need to deal with in Africa as the continent is to deal with the question of food security, to limit question on malnutrition and hunger that we're seeing with so much resources that we have in the continent. There's a need for leadership that will deal with this question of food security. Prof. Isike has spoken about building the capacity of the state institution within the continent. I think that we need to do like yesterday, because the current African state, it's so weak. And these weaknesses are, most of them, self-made. And we have the capacity to turn things around and deal with building this capacity of the institution. The question of conflict resolution, I think at the AU, there's a need to develop institutional capacity to do early warning system, to look at the underlying sources of the conflict and early intervention as an institutional framework to deal with these issues, not on part-time basis. So there's a need for that. The other thing that was raised by Ayisah, very important, the question of research and development. There's a need to spend more on R&D. I think the Chinese are spending between 7 and 8% of their GDP on R&D. And that's why you are seeing all this development, new innovation on everything. We're going to end up being consumers with the amount of resources that we have. Lastly, I think we have to judge the Trump administration in terms of their new policies. What are the policies that they are going to come up with?
Kingsley, just a question as we are talking from a head of state says you have to appreciate that paying salaries is a struggle every month. One of them said they have to borrow money to pay salaries, that you have to factor that into your R&D talk, that they are borrowing money to pay salaries. This question just came as we are talking.
I think, to Your Excellency, it's a question of a chicken and egg, which one comes first. We need to break the cycle of really being dependent on earning salary and start building wealth that can be better distributed even to those who have no access to salary, those who are less fortunate, and so on. And until we come up with some investment in research and development, because research and development will give you new disruptive ideas of dealing with the challenges you're facing. You know, in 1991, I was in the United States when Al Gore and Bill Clinton were running for office. Al Gore had a famous thing to say they're going to build an information highway, and they're going to have internet built on every bridge and so on. The rest is history. They have Facebook, they have everything that came out of the United States. It tells you that they have dedicated a lot of research and development. The Chinese are doing the same. And that's a way of breaking the cycle of salaries. Salaries is not wealth. We need to create wealth, in my own view. And I'm saying, lastly, on the question of the Trump administration, we have to judge them on the basis of how they distribute their resources between the cohesive power and the soft power, that is the State Department and the Pentagon. For the last few years, the State Department has been underfunded. And as a result, they couldn't undertake certain operations that they need to do. And that's why the United States has been shifting and really putting more reliance on brute force. And they've realized now that brute force is not sustainable. So these are some of the issues that we'd like to see with the new administration. I think it's early. They want to develop policies. We have to wait for these policies and be able to interact with the policies that are coming out of Washington. But I want to thank you, everyone who participated and those who are still here. I know there are millions who are listening and watching. I'm most grateful for listening to us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And the audience will increase in number in the days ahead because they're going to watch on YouTube and Facebook. So more and more we watch, and we are releasing the transcript in the next 2 minutes to the world to see. I have to thank all of you. I wasn't expecting this kind of very high energy, impactful conversation, and I'm grateful that you've benefited the world. And I'm grateful that 11 African presidents watch this program, which means they are attaching significance to this, to the rise of Trump, and they are respecting your opinions. Otherwise, they will not be spending their time. And those of you who join on Zoom, we use Zoom to stream to other platforms. We can't thank you enough. It's a very high number for Zoom participation. Next week, we talk about biography. For those who have asked Kingsley to write his memoir, maybe you should join, in which we take some lessons on how to do this. And until next week, I'm very grateful, and I thank you, all of you. Please, let's play some music while you are eating your dinner. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Are you serving us dinner?